Chapter 18 of the Book of the Damned. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Acacia Wood. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. Chapter 18. The New Dominant. I mean, primarily, all that opposes exclusionism. That development or progress or evolution is attempt to positivize, and is a mechanism by which a positive existence is recruited. That what we call existence is a womb of infinitude, and is itself only incubatory. That eventually all attempts are broken down by the falsely excluded. Subjectively, the breaking down is aided by our own sense of false and narrow limitations. So the classic and academic artists wrought positivist paintings, and express the only ideal that I am conscious of, though we so often hear of ideals instead of different manifestations, artistically, scientifically, theologically, politically, of the one ideal. They sought to satisfy, in its artistic aspect, cosmic craving for unity or completeness, sometimes called harmony, called beauty in some aspects. By disregard, they sought completeness. But the light effects that they disregarded, and their narrow confinement to standardized subjects, brought on the revolt of the Impressionists. So the Puritans tried to systematize, and they disregarded physical needs, or vices, or relaxations. They were invaded and overthrown when their narrowness became obvious and intolerable. All things strive for positiveness for themselves, or for quasi-systems of which they are parts. Formality and the mathematic, the regular and the uniform, are aspects of the positive state. But the positive is the universal, so all attempted positiveness that seems to satisfy in the aspects of formality and regularity, sooner or later disqualifies in the aspect of wideness or universalness. So there is revolt against the science of today, because the formulated utterances that were regarded as final truths in a past generation are now seen to be insufficiencies. Every pronouncement that has opposed our own acceptances has been found to be a composition like any academic painting, something that is arbitrarily cut off from relations with environment, or framed off from interfering and disturbing data, or outlined with disregards. Our own attempt has been to take in the included, but also to take in the excluded into wider expressions. We accept, however, that for every one of our expressions there are irreconcilable somewhere. That final utterance would include all things. However, of such is the gossip of angels. The final is unutterable in quasi-existence, where to think is to include but also to exclude, or be not final. If we admit that for every opinion we have expressed there must somewhere be an irreconcilable, we are intermediatists, and not positivists, not even higher positivists. Of course, it may be that some day we shall systematize and dogmatize, and refuse to think of anything that we may be accused of disregarding, and believe instead of merely accepting. Then, if we could have a wider system which would acknowledge no irreconcilables, we'd be higher positivists. So long as we only accept, we are not higher positivists, but our feeling is that the new dominant, even though we have thought of it only as another enslavement, will be the nucleus for higher positivism, and that it will be the means of elevating into infinitude a new batch of fixed stars, until, as a recruiting instrument, it too will play out, and will give way to some new medium for generating absoluteness. It is our acceptance that all astronomers of today have lost their souls, or rather, all chance of attaining entity, but that Copernicus and Kepler, and Galileo and Newton, and conceivably Leverrier, are now fixed stars. Some day I shall attempt to identify them. In all this, I think we're quite a Moses. We point out the promised land, but unless we be cured of our intermediatism, we will never be reported in monthly notices ourselves. In our acceptance, dominants, in their succession, displace preceding dominants not only because they are more nearly positive, but because the old dominants, as recruiting mediums, play out. Our expression is that the new dominant, of wider inclusions, is now manifesting throughout the world, and that the old exclusionism is everywhere breaking down. In physics, exclusionism is breaking down by its own researches in radium, for instance, and in its speculations upon electrons, or its merging away into metaphysics, and by the desertion that has been going on for many years by such men as Gurney, Crookes, Wallace, Flammarion, Lodge, to formally disregard phenomena, no longer called spiritualism, but now psychic research. Biology is in chaos. Conventional Darwinites mixed up with mutationists and orthogenicists and followers of Weismann, who take from Darwinism one of its pseudo-bases, and nevertheless try to reconcile their heresies with orthodoxy. The painters are metaphysicians and psychologists. The breaking down of exclusionism in China and Japan and in the United States has astonished history. The science of astronomy is going downward so that, though Pickering, for instance, did speculate upon a trans-Neptunian planet, and Lowell did try to have accepted heretical ideas as to marks on Mars, attention is now minutely focused upon such technicalities as variations and shades of Jupiter's fourth satellite. I think that, in general acceptance, over-refinement indicates decadence. I think that the stronghold of inclusionism is in aeronautics. I think that the stronghold of the old dominant, when it was new, was in the invention of the telescope. Or that, coincidentally, with the breakdown of exclusionism appears the means of finding out whether there are vast aerial fields of ice and floating lakes full of frogs and fishes or not, where carved stones and black substances and great quantities of vegetable matter and flesh, which may be dragon's flesh, come from, whether there are interplanetary trade routes and vast areas devastated by super Tamerlanes, whether sometimes there are visitors to this earth, who might be pursued and captured and questioned. End of chapter 18. Recording by Acacia Wood. Chapter 19 of the Book of the Damned. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Acacia Wood. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. Chapter 19. I have industriously sought data for an expression upon birds, but the prospecting has not been very quasi-satisfactory. I think I rather emphasize our industriousness because a charge likely to be brought against the attitude of acceptance is that one who only accepts must be one of languid interest and little application of energy. It doesn't seem to work out. We are very industrious. I suggest to some of our disciples that they look into the matter of messages upon pigeons, of course attributed to earthly owners, but said to be undecipherable. I'd do it ourselves, only that would be selfish. That's more of the intermediatism that will keep us out of the firmament. Positivism is absolute egoism. But look back in the time of André's polar expedition. Pigeons that would have no publicity ordinarily were often reported at that time. In the Zoologist 3/1821 is recorded an instance of a bird, puffin, that had fallen to the ground with a fractured head. Interesting, but mere speculation. But what solid object, high in the air, had that bird struck against? Tremendous red rain in France, October 16 and 17, 1846. Great storm at the time, and red rain supposed to have been colored by matter swept up from this earth's surface and then precipitated. Comptes Rendus 23, 832. But in Comptes Rendus 24, 625, the description of this red rain differs from one's impression of red, sandy, or muddy water. It is said that this rain was so vividly red and so blood-like that many persons in France were terrified. 2 analyses are given, Comptes Rendus 24, 8-12. One chemist notes a great quantity of corpuscles, whether blood-like corpuscles or not, in the matter. The other chemist sets down organic matter at 35%. It may be that an interplanetary dragon had been slain somewhere, or that this red fluid, in which were many corpuscles, came from something not altogether pleasant to contemplate, about the size of the Catskill Mountains, perhaps. But the present datum is that with this substance, larks, quail, ducks, and water hens, some of them alive, fell at Lyons and Grenoble, and other places. I have notes upon other birds that have fallen from the sky, but unaccompanied by the red rain that makes the fall of birds in France peculiar, and very peculiar if it be accepted that the red substance was extra-mundane. The other notes are upon birds that have fallen from the sky in the midst of storms, or of exhausted but living birds falling not far from a storm area. But now we shall have an instance for which I can find no parallel: fall of dead birds from a clear sky, far distant from any storm to which they could be attributed, so remote from any discoverable storm that my own notion is that in the summer of 1896 something or some beings came as near to this earth as they could upon a hunting expedition. That in the summer of 1896 an expedition of super scientists passed over this earth and let down a dragnet, and what would it catch sweeping through the air, supposing it to have reached not quite to this earth? In the Monthly Weather Review, May, 1917, W. L. McCaddy quotes from the Baton Rouge correspondence to the Philadelphia Times, that in the summer of 1896, into the streets of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and from a clear sky, fell hundreds of dead birds. There were wild ducks and catbirds, woodpeckers, and many birds of strange plumage, some of them resembling canaries. Usually one does not have to look very far from any place to learn of a storm, but the best that could be done in this instance was to say there had been a storm on the coast of Florida. And unless he have psychochemic repulsion for the explanation, the reader feels only momentary astonishment that dead birds from a storm in Florida should fall from an unstormy sky in Louisiana, and with his intellect greased like the plumage of a wild duck, the datum then drops off. Our greasy, shiny brains. That they may be of some use after all. That other modes of existence place a high value upon them as lubricants. That we're hunted for them. A hunting expedition to this earth. The newspapers report a tornado. If from a clear sky, or a sky in which there were no driven clouds, or other evidences of still continuing wind power, or if from a storm in Florida, it could be accepted that hundreds of birds had fallen far away in Louisiana, I conceive conventionally of heavier objects having fallen in Alabama, say, and of the fall of still heavier objects still nearer the origin in Florida. The sources of information of the Weather Bureau are widespread. It has no records of such falls. So a dragnet that was let down from above somewhere, or something that I learned from the more scientific of the investigators of psychic phenomena. The reader begins their works with prejudice against telepathy and everything else of psychic phenomenon. The writers deny spirit communication and say that the seeming data are data of only telepathy. Astonishing instances of seeming clairvoyance, only telepathy. After a while, the reader finds himself agreeing that it's only telepathy, which at first had been intolerable to him. So maybe in 1896 a super dragnet did not sweep through this Earth's atmosphere, gathering up all the birds within its field, the meshes then suddenly breaking. Or that the birds of Baton Rouge were only from the super Sargasso Sea. Upon which we shall have another expression. We thought we'd settled that, and we thought we'd established that, but nothing's ever settled, and nothing's ever established in a real sense, if, in a real sense, there is nothing in quasiness. I suppose there had been a storm somewhere, the storm in Florida perhaps, and many birds had been swept upward into the Super Sargasso Sea. It has frigid regions, and it has tropical regions. That birds of diverse species had been swept upward into an icy region, where, huddling together for warmth, they had died. Then later they had been dislodged, meteor coming along, boat, bicycle, dragon, don't know what did come along. Something dislodged them. So leaves of trees, carried up there in whirlwinds, staying there years, ages, perhaps only a few months, but then falling to this earth at an unseasonable time for dead leaves. Fishes carried up there, some of them dying and drying, some of them living in volumes of water that are in abundance up there, or that fall sometimes in the deluges that we call cloudbursts. The astronomers won't think kindly of us, and we haven't done anything to endear ourselves to the meteorologists. But we're weak and mawkish intermediatists. Several times we've tried to get the aeronauts with us. Extraordinary things up there. Things that curators of museums would give up all hope of ever being fixed stars to obtain. Things left over from whirlwinds of the time of the pharaohs, perhaps. Or that Elijah did go up in the sky in something like a chariot, and may not be Vega after all, and that there may be a wheel or so left of whatever he went up in. We basely suggest that it would bring a high price, but sell soon, because after a while there'd be thousands of them hawked around. We weekly drop a hint to the aeronauts. In the Scientific American 33-197, there is an account of some hay that fell from the sky. From the circumstances, we incline to accept that this hay went up in a whirlwind, from this earth, in the first place, reached the Super Sargasso Sea, and remained there a long time before falling. An interesting point in this expression is the usual attribution to a local and coinciding whirlwind and identification of it, and then data that make that local whirlwind unacceptable. That, upon July 27, 1875, small masses of damp hay had fallen at Monkstown, Ireland. In the Dublin Daily Express, Dr. J. W. Moore had explained he had found a nearby whirlwind to the south of Monkstown that coincided. But according to the Scientific American, a similar fall had occurred near Wrexham, England, 2 days before. In November 1918, I made some studies upon light objects thrown into the air. Armistice Day. I suppose I should have been more emotionally occupied, but I made notes upon torn-up papers thrown high in the air from windows of office buildings. Scraps of paper did stay together for a while, several minutes sometimes. Cosmos, 3-4-574. That, upon the 10th of April, 1869, at Autrich, Indre at Lohr, a great number of oak leaves, enormous segregation of them, fell from the sky. Very calm day. So little wind that the leaves fell almost vertically. Fall lasted about 10 minutes. Flammarion in The Atmosphere, page 412, tells this story. He has to find a storm. He does find a squall. But it had occurred upon April 3rd. Flammarion's two incredibilities are that leaves could remain a week in the air, that they could stay together a week in the air. Think of some of your own observations upon papers thrown from an airplane. Our one incredibility, that these leaves had been whirled up 6 months before when they were common on the ground, and had been sustained, of course not in the air, but in a region gravitationally inert, and had been precipitated by the disturbances of April rains. I have no records of leaves that have so fallen from the sky in October or November, the season when one might expect dead leaves to be raised from one place and precipitated somewhere else. I emphasize that this occurred in April. La Nature, 1889-94. That upon April 19th, 1889, dried leaves of different species, oak, elm, etc., fell from the sky. This day, too, was a calm day. The fall was tremendous. The leaves were seen to fall 15 minutes, but, judging from the quantity on the ground, it is the writer's opinion that they had already been falling half an hour. I think that the geyser of corpses that sprang from Riobamba toward the sky must have been an interesting sight. If I were a painter, I'd like that subject. But this cataract of dried leaves, too, is a study in the rhythms of the dead. In this datum, the point most agreeable to us is the very point that the writer in La Nature emphasizes: windlessness. He says that the surface of the Loire was absolutely smooth. The river was strewn with leaves as far as he could see. L'Astronomie, 1894-194. That, upon the 7th of April, 1894, dried leaves fell at Clairvaux and Outre-Aube, France. The fall is described as prodigious. Half an hour. Then, upon the 11th, a fall of dried leaves occurred at Pontcarré. It is in this recurrence that we found some of our opposition to the conventional explanation. The editor, Flammarion, explains. He says that the leaves had been caught up in a cyclone which had expended its force, that the heavier leaves had fallen first. We think that that was all right for 1894, and that it was quite good enough for 1894. But in these more exacting days, we want to know how wind power insufficient to hold some leaves in the air could sustain others 4 days. The factors in this expression are unseasonableness, not for dried leaves, but for prodigious numbers of dried leaves, direct fall, windlessness, month of April, and localization in France. The factor of localization is interesting. Not a note have I upon fall of leaves from the sky, except these notes. Were the conventional explanation, or old correlate, acceptable, it would seem that similar occurrences in other regions should be as frequent as in France. The indication is that there may be quasi-permanent undulations in the Super Sargasso Sea, or a pronounced inclination toward France. Inspiration. That there may be a nearby world, complementary to this world, where autumn occurs at the time that is springtime here. Let some disciple have that. But there may be a dip toward France, so that leaves that are born high there are more likely to be held in suspension than high-flying leaves elsewhere. Some other time I shall take up supergeography and be guilty of charts. I think now that the Super Sargasso Sea is an oblique belt with changing ramifications over Great Britain, France, Italy, and on to India. Relatively to the United States, I am not very clear, but think especially of the southern states. The preponderance of our data indicates frigid regions aloft. Nevertheless, such phenomena as putrefaction have occurred often enough to make supertropical regions also acceptable. We shall have one more datum upon the Super Sargasso Sea. It seems to me that, by this time, our requirements of support and reinforcement and agreement have been quite as rigorous for acceptance as ever for belief, at least for full acceptance. By virtue of mere acceptance, we may, in some later book, deny the Super Sargasso Sea, and find that our data relate to some other complementary world instead, or the moon, and have abundant data for accepting that the moon is not more than 20 or 30 miles away. However, the Super Sargasso Sea functions very well as a nucleus around which to gather data that oppose exclusionism. That is our main motive, to oppose exclusionism, or our agreement with cosmic processes. The climax of our general expression upon the Super Sargasso Sea coincidentally appears something else that may overthrow it later. Notes and Queries, 8-12-228. That in the province of Macerata, Italy, summer of 1897, an immense number of small, blood-colored clouds covered the sky. About an hour later a storm broke, and myriad seeds fell to the ground. It is said that they were identified as products of a tree found only in Central Africa and the Antilles. If, in terms of conventional reasoning, these seeds had been high in the air, they had been in a cold region. But it is our acceptance that these seeds had, for a considerable time, been in a warm region, and for a time longer than is attributable to suspension by wind power. It is said that a great number of the seeds were in the first stage of germination. End of chapter 19. Recording by Acacia Wood. Chapter 20 of the Book of the Damned. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Acacia Wood. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. Chapter 20. The New Dominant. Inclusionism. In it we have a pseudo-standard. We have a datum, and we give it an interpretation in accordance with our pseudo-standard. At present, we have not the delusions of absolutism that may have translated some of the positivists of the 19th century to heaven. We are intermediatists, but feel a lurking suspicion that we may some day solidify and dogmatize and illiberalize into higher positivists. At present, we do not ask whether something be reasonable or preposterous, because we recognize that by reasonableness and preposterousness are meant agreement and disagreement with a standard, which must be a delusion, though not absolutely, of course, and must some day be displaced by a more advanced quasi-delusion. Scientists in the past have taken the positivist attitude, is this or that reasonable or unreasonable? Analyze them, and we find that they meant relatively to a standard, such as Newtonism, Daltonism, Darwinism, or Lyellism. But they have written and spoken and thought as if they could mean real reasonableness and real unreasonableness. So our pseudo-standard is inclusionism, and if a datum be a correlate to a more widely inclusive outlook as to this earth and its externality and relations with externality, its harmony with inclusionism admits it. Such was the process, and such was the requirement for admission in the days of the Old Dominant. Our difference is an underlying intermediatism, or consciousness that though we're more nearly real, we and our standards are only quasi. Or that all things in our intermediate state are phantoms in a supermind in a dreaming state, but striving to awaken to realness. Though in some respects our own intermediatism is unsatisfactory, our underlying feeling is that in a dreaming mind, awakening is accelerated. If phantoms in that mind know that they're only phantoms in a dream. Of course, they too are quasi, but in a relative sense, they have an essence of what is called realness. They are derived from experience or from sense relations, even though grotesque distortions. It seems acceptable that a table that is seen when one is awake is more nearly real than a dreamed table which, with 15 or 20 legs, chases one. So now, in the 20th century, with a change of terms and a change in underlying consciousness, our attitude toward the new dominant is the attitude of the scientists of the 19th century to the old dominant. We do not insist that our data and interpretations shall be shocking, grotesque, evil, ridiculous, childish, insincere, laughable, ignorant to 19th centuryites as were their data and interpretations to the medieval-minded. We ask only whether data and interpretations correlate. If they do, they are acceptable, perhaps only for a short time, or as nuclei, or scaffolding, or preliminary sketches, or as gropings and tentativenesses. Later, of course, when we cool off and harden and radiate into space most of our present mobility, which expresses in modesty and plasticity, we shall acknowledge no scaffoldings, gropings, or tentativenesses, but think we utter absolute facts. A point in intermediatism here is opposed to most current speculations upon development. Usually one thinks of the spiritual as higher than the material, but in our acceptance, quasi-existence is a means by which the absolutely immaterial materializes absolutely, and, being intermediate, is a state in which nothing is finally either immaterial or material. All objects, substances, thoughts, occupying some grade of approximation one way or the other. Final solidification of the ethereal is, to us, the goal of cosmic ambition. Positivism is Puritanism. Heat is evil. Final good is absolute frigidity. An Arctic winter is very beautiful, but I think that an interest in monkeys chattering in palm trees accounts for our own intermediatism. Visitors. Our confusion here, out of which we are attempting to make quasi-order, is as great as it has been throughout this book, because we have not the positivist's delusion of homogeneity. A positivist would gather all data that seem to relate to one kind of visitors and coldly disregard all other data. I think of as many different kinds of visitors to this earth as there are visitors to New York, to a jail, to a church. Some persons go to church to pickpockets, for instance. My own acceptance is that either a world or a vast superconstruction, or a world, if red substances and fishes fell from it, hovered over India in the summer of 1860. Something then fell from somewhere July 17, 1860, at Dharamsala. Whatever it was, it is so persistently alluded to as a meteorite that I look back and see that I adopted this convention myself. But in the London Times, December 26, 1860, Syed Abdullah, professor of Hindustani, University College London, writes that he had sent to a friend in Dharamsala for an account of the stones that had fallen at that place. The answer? Diverse forms and sizes, many of which bore great resemblance to ordinary cannonballs just discharged from engines of war. It's an addition to our data of spherical objects that have arrived upon this earth. Note that they are spherical stone objects. And in the evening of the same day that something took a shot at Dharamsala, or sent objects upon which there may be decipherable markings, lights were seen in the air. I think myself of a number of things, beings, whatever they were, trying to get down, but resisted like balloonists at a certain altitude, trying to get farther up, but resisted. Not in the least except to good positivists, or the homogeneous-minded, does this speculation interfere with the concept of some other world that is in successful communication with certain esoteric ones upon this earth, by a code of symbols that print in rock, like symbols of telephotographers in selenium. I think that sometimes, in favorable circumstances, emissaries have come to this earth. Secret meetings. Of course it sounds, but secret meetings, emissaries, esoteric ones in Europe before the war broke out, and those who suggested that such phenomena could be. However, as to most of our data, I think of super things that have passed close to this earth with no more interest in this earth than have passengers upon a steamship in the bottom of the sea, or passengers may have a keen interest, but circumstances of schedules and commercial requirements forbid investigation of the bottom of the sea. Then, on the other hand, we may have data of super-scientific attempts to investigate phenomena of this earth from above, perhaps by beings from so far away that they had never even heard that something, somewhere, asserts a legal right to this earth. Altogether, we're good intermediatists, but we can't be very good hypnotists. Still another source of the merging away of our data, that upon general principles of continuity, if super vessels or super vehicles have traversed this Earth's atmosphere, there must be mergers between them and terrestrial phenomena. Observations upon them must merge away into observations upon clouds and balloons and meteors. We shall begin with data that we cannot distinguish ourselves and work our way out of mergers into extremes. In the observatory 35-168, it is said that, according to a newspaper, March 6, 1912, residents of Warmley, England, were greatly excited by something that was supposed to be a splendidly illuminated aeroplane passing over the village. The machine was apparently traveling at a tremendous rate and came from the direction of Bath and went on towards Gloucester. The editor says that it was a large, triple-headed fireball. Tremendous indeed, he says, but we are prepared for anything nowadays. That is satisfactory. We'd not like to creep up stealthily and then jump out of a corner with our data. This editor, at least, is prepared to read. Nature, October 27, 1898. A correspondent writes that, in the County Wicklow, Ireland, at about 6 o'clock in the evening, he had seen, in the sky, an object that looked like the moon in its three-quarter aspect. We note the shape which approximates to triangularity, and we note that in color it is said to have been golden yellow. It moved slowly, and in about 5 minutes disappeared behind a mountain. The editor gives his opinion that the object may have been an escaped balloon. In Nature, August 11, 1898, there is a story taken from the July number of the Canadian Weather Review by the meteorologist F. Payne, that he had seen in the Canadian sky a large, pear-shaped object sailing rapidly. At first he supposed that the object was a balloon, its outline being sharply defined. But as no cage was seen, it was concluded that it must be a mass of cloud. In about 6 minutes this object became less definite, whether because of increasing distance or not. The mass became less dense, and finally it disappeared. As a cyclonic formation, no whirling motion could be seen. Nature, 58-294, that upon July 8, 1898, a correspondent had seen, at Kiel, an object in the sky, colored red by the sun, which had set. It was about as broad as a rainbow and about 12 degrees high. It remained in its original brightness about 5 minutes, and then faded rapidly, and then remained almost stationary again, finally disappearing about 8 minutes after I first saw it. In an intermediate existence, we quasi-persons have nothing to judge by because everything is its own opposite. If $100 a week be a standard of luxurious living to some persons, it is poverty to others. We have instances of 3 objects that were seen in the sky in a space of 3 months, and this concurrence seems to me to be something to judge by. Science has been built upon concurrence. So have been most of the fallacies and fanaticisms. I feel the positivism of a Leverrier, or instinctively take to the notion that all 3 of these observations relate to the same object. However, I don't formulate them and predict the next transit. Here's another chance for me to become a fixed star, but as usual, oh well, a point in intermediatism, that the intermediatist is likely to be a flaccid compromiser. Our own attitude. Ours is a partly positive and partly negative state, or a state in which nothing is finally positive or finally negative. But if positivism attracts you, go ahead and try. You will be in harmony with cosmic endeavor. But continuity will resist you. Only to have appearance in quasiness is to be proportionately positive, but beyond a degree of attempted positivism, continuity will rise to pull you back. Success, as it is called, though there is only success-failure in intermediateness, will, in intermediateness, be yours proportionately as you are in adjustment with its own state, or some positivism mixed with compromise and retreat. To be very positive is to be a Napoleon Bonaparte, against whom the rest of civilization will sooner or later combine. For interesting data, see newspaper accounts of fate of one Dowie, of Chicago. Intermediatism, then, is recognition that our state is only a quasi-state. It is no bar to one who desires to be positive. It is recognition that he cannot be positive and remain in a state that is positive-negative, or that a great positivist, isolated, with no system to support him, will be crucified, or will starve to death, or will be put in jail and beaten to death, that these are the birth pangs of translation to the positive absolute. So, though positive-negative myself, I feel the attraction of the positive pole of our intermediate state, and attempt to correlate these 3 data, to see them homogeneously, to think that they relate to one object. In the aeronautic journals and in the London Times, there is no mention of escaped balloons in the summer or fall of 1898. In the New York Times, there is no mention of ballooning in Canada or the United States in the summer of 1898. London Times, September 29, 1885. A clipping from the Royal Gazette of Bermuda of September 8, 1885, sent to the Times by General Lefroy. That upon August 27, 1885, at about 8:30 a.m., there was observed by Mrs. Adelina D. Bassett a strange object in the clouds coming from the north. She called the attention of Mrs. L. Lowell to it, and they were both somewhat alarmed. However, they continued to watch the object steadily for some time. It drew nearer. It was of triangular shape, and seemed to be about the size of a pilot boat mainsail, with chains attached to the bottom of it. While crossing the land, it had appeared to descend, but, as it went out to sea, it ascended and continued to ascend until it was lost to sight high in the clouds. Or with such power to ascend, I don't think much myself of the notion that it was an escaped balloon, partly deflated. Nevertheless, General Lefroy, correlating with exclusionism, attempts to give a terrestrial interpretation to this occurrence. He argues that the thing may have been a balloon that had escaped from France or England, or the only aerial thing of terrestrial origin that, even to this date of about 35 years later, has been thought to have crossed the Atlantic Ocean. He accounts for the triangular form by deflation, a shapeless bag, barely able to float. My own acceptance is that great deflation does not accord with observations upon its power to ascend. In the Times, October 1st, 1885, Charles Harding of the RMS argues that if it had been a balloon from Europe, surely it would have been seen and reported by many vessels. Whether he was as good a Briton as the general or not, he shows awareness of the United States, or that the thing may have been a partly collapsed balloon that had escaped from the United States. General Lefroy wrote to Nature about it, Nature 3399, saying, whatever his sensitivenesses may have been, that the columns of the Times were hardly suitable for such a discussion. If, in the past, there had been more persons like General Lefroy, we'd have better than the mere fragments of data that in most cases are too broken up very well to piece together. He took the trouble to write to a friend of his, W. H. Gosling, of Bermuda, who also was an extraordinary person. He went to the trouble of interviewing Mrs. Bassett and Mrs. Lowell. Their description to him was somewhat different. An object from which nets were suspended. Deflated balloon with its network hanging from it. A super dragnet? That something was trawling overhead? The birds of Baton Rouge. Mr. Gosling wrote that the item of chains, or suggestion of a basket that had been attached, had originated with Mr. Bassett, who had not seen the object. Mr. Gosling mentioned a balloon that had escaped from Paris in July. He tells of a balloon that fell in Chicago September 17th, or 3 weeks later than the Bermuda object. It's one incredibility against another, with disregards and convictions governed by whichever of the two dominants looms stronger in each reader's mind. That he can't think for himself any more than I can is understood. My own correlates. I think that we're fished for. It may be that we're highly esteemed by super epicures somewhere. It makes me more cheerful when I think that we may be of some use after all. I think that dragnets have often come down and have been mistaken for whirlwinds and waterspouts. Some accounts of seeming structure in whirlwinds and waterspouts are astonishing. And I have data that, in this book, I can't take up at all. Mysterious disappearances. I think we're fished for. But this is a little expression on the side, relates to trespassers, has nothing to do with the subject that I shall take up at some other time, or our use to some other mode of seeming that has a legal right to us. Nature 33-137. Our Paris correspondent writes that in relation to the balloon which is said to have been seen over Bermuda in September, no ascent took place in France which can account for it. Last of August, not September. In the London Times there is no mention of balloon ascents in Great Britain in the summer of 1885, but mention of 2 ascents in France. Both balloons had escaped. In L'Aeronaute, August 1885, it is said that these balloons had been sent up from fêtes of the 14th of July, 44 days before the observation at Bermuda. The aeronauts were Gower and Alloy. Gower's balloon was found floating on the ocean, but Alloy's balloon was not found. Upon the 17th of July, it was reported by a sea captain, still in the air, still inflated. But this balloon of Alloy's was a small exhibition balloon made for short ascents from fêtes and fairgrounds. In La Nature, 1885-131, it is said that it was a very small balloon, incapable of remaining long in the air. As to contemporaneous ballooning in the United States, I find only one account, an ascent in Connecticut, July 29, 1885. Upon leaving this balloon, the aeronauts had pulled the ripcord, turning it inside out. New York Times, August 10, 1885. To the intermediatist, the accusation of anthropomorphism is meaningless. There is nothing in anything that is unique or positively different. We'd be materialists were it not quite as rational to express the material in terms of the immaterial as to express the immaterial in terms of the material. Oneness of allness in quasiness. I will engage to write the formula of any novel in psychochemic terms, or draw its graph in psychomechanic terms, or write, in romantic terms, the circumstances and sequences of any chemic or electric or magnetic reaction, or express any historic event in algebraic terms, or see Boole and Jevons for economic situations, expressed algebraically. I think of the dominants as I think of persons, not meaning that they are real persons, not meaning that we are real persons. Or the old dominant and its jealousy, and its suppression of all things and thoughts that endangered its supremacy. In reading discussions of papers by scientific societies, I have often noted how, when they approached forbidden or irreconcilable subjects, the discussions were thrown into confusion and ramification. It's as if scientific discussions have often been led astray, as if purposefully, as if by something directive hovering over them. Of course, I mean only the spirit of all development. Just so, in any embryo, cells that would tend to vary from the appearances of their era are compelled to correlate. In Nature 90-169, Charles Tilden Smith writes that, at Chisbury, Wiltshire, England, April 8, 1912, he saw something in the sky, unlike anything that I had ever seen before. Although I have studied the skies for many years, I have never seen anything like it. He saw two stationary dark patches upon clouds. The extraordinary part, they were stationary upon clouds that were rapidly moving. They were fan-shaped, or triangular, and varied in size, but kept the same position upon different clouds as cloud after cloud came along. For more than half an hour Mr. Smith watched these dark patches. His impression as to the one that appeared first, that it was really a heavy shadow cast upon a thin veil of clouds by some unseen object away in the west, which was intercepting the sun's rays. Upon page 244 of this volume of Nature is a letter from another correspondent to the effect that similar shadows are cast by mountains upon clouds, and that no doubt Mr. Smith was right in attributing the appearance to some unseen object which was intercepting the sun's rays. But the old dominant that was a jealous dominant, and the wrath of the old dominant against such an irreconcilability as large, opaque objects in the sky, casting down shadows upon clouds. Still the dominants are suave very often, or are not absolute gods, and the way attention was led away from this subject is an interesting study in quasi-divine bamboozlement. Upon page 268, Charles J. P. Cave, the meteorologist, writes that upon April 5 and 8 at Ditcham Park, Petersfield, he had observed a similar appearance while watching some pilot balloons, but he describes something not in the least like a shadow on clouds, but a stationary cloud. The inference seems to be that the shadows at Chisbury may have been shadows of pilot balloons. Upon page 322, another correspondent writes upon shadows cast by mountains. Upon page 348, someone else carries on the divergence by discussing this third letter. Then someone takes up the third letter mathematically, and then there is a correction of error in this mathematic demonstration. I think it looks very much like what I think it looks like. But the mystery here, that the dark patches at Chisbury could not have been cast by stationary pilot balloons that were to the west, or that were between clouds and the setting sun. If to the west of Chisbury a stationary object were high in the air, intercepting the sun's rays, the shadow of the stationary object would not have been stationary, but would have moved higher and higher with the setting of the sun. I have to think of something that is in accord with no other data whatsoever. A luminous body, not the sun, in the sky, but because of some unknown principle or atmospheric condition, its light extended down only about to the clouds, that from it were suspended two triangular objects, like the object that was seen in Bermuda, that it was this light that fell short of the earth that these objects intercepted, that the objects were drawn up and lowered from something overhead so that, in its light, their shadows changed size. If my grope seems to have no grasp in it, and if a stationary balloon will, in half an hour, not cast a stationary shadow from the setting sun,
we have to think of two triangular objects that accurately maintain positions in a line between sun and clouds, and at the same time approach and receded from clouds. Whatever it may have been, it's enough to make the devout make the sign of the crucible, or whatever the devotees of the old dominant do in the presence of a new correlate. Vast, black thing poised like a crow over the moon. It is our acceptance that these two shadows of Chisbury looked, from the moon, like vast things, black as crows, poised over the earth. It is our acceptance that two triangular luminosities and then two triangular patches, like vast black things, poised like crows over the moon, and, like the triangularities at Chisbury, have been seen upon or over the moon. Scientific American 46-49. Two triangular luminous appearances reported by several observers in Lebanon, Connecticut, evening of July 3, 1882, on the moon's upper limb. They disappeared, and two dark triangular appearances that looked like notches were seen 3 minutes later upon the lower limb. They approached each other, met, and instantly disappeared. The merger here is notches that have at times been seen upon the moon's limb, thought to be cross-sections of craters. Monthly notices RAS 37432. But these appearances of July 3, 1882 were vast upon the moon, seemed to be cutting off or obliterating nearly a quarter of its surface. Something else that may have looked like a vast black crow poised over this earth from the moon. Monthly Weather Review 41-599. Description of a shadow in the sky of some unseen body, April 8, 1913, Fort Worth, Texas, supposed to have been cast by an unseen cloud. This patch of shade moved with the declining sun. Report of the British Association, 1854, 410. Account by two observers of a faint but distinctly triangular object visible for 6 nights in the sky. It was observed from two stations that were not far apart. But the parallax was considerable. Whatever it was acceptably, relatively close to this earth. I should say that relatively to phenomena of light we are in confusion as great as some of the discords that orthodoxy is in relatively to light. Broadly and intermediatistically, our position is that light is not really and necessarily light, any more than is anything else really and necessarily anything, but an interpretation of a mode of force, as I suppose we have to call it, as light. At sea level, the Earth's atmosphere interprets sunlight as red or orange or yellow. High up on mountains, the sun is blue. Very high up on mountains, the zenith is black. Or it is orthodoxy to say that in interplanetary space, where there is no air, there is no light. So then the sun and comets are black. But this Earth's atmosphere, or rather dust particles in it, interpret radiations from these black objects as light. We look up at the moon. The jet black moon is so silvery white. I have about 50 notes indicating that the moon has atmosphere. Nevertheless, most astronomers hold out that the moon has no atmosphere. They have to. The theory of eclipses would not work out otherwise. So, arguing in conventional terms, the moon is black. Rather astonishing, explorers upon the moon, stumbling and groping in intense darkness, with telescopes powerful enough, we could see them stumbling and groping in brilliant light. Or, just because of familiarity, it is not now obvious to us how the preposterousness of the old system must have seemed to the correlates of the system preceding it. Ye jet black silvery moon. Altogether, then, it may be conceivable that there are phenomena of force that are interpretable as light as far down as the clouds, but not in denser strata of air, or just the opposite of familiar interpretations. I now have some notes upon an occurrence that suggests a force not interpreted by air as light, but interpreted or reflected by the ground as light. I think of something that, for a week, was suspended over London, of an emanation that was not interpreted as light until it reached the ground. Lancet, June 1, 1867. That every night for a week, a light had appeared in Woburn Square, London, upon the grass of a small park enclosed by railings. crowds gathering, police called out for the special service of maintaining order and making the populace move on. The editor of the Lancet went to the square. He says that he saw nothing but a patch of light falling upon an arbor at the northeast corner of the enclosure. Seems to me that that was interesting enough. In this editor, we have a companion for Mr. Simons and Dr. Gray. He suggests that the light came from a street lamp. Does not say that he could trace it to any such origin himself, but recommends that the police investigate neighboring street lamps. I'd not say that such a commonplace as light from a street lamp would not attract and excite and deceive great crowds for a week, but I do accept that any cop who was called upon for extra work would have needed nobody's suggestion to settle that point the very first thing. Or that something in the sky hung suspended over a London square for a week. End of Chapter 20. Recording by Acacia Wood.
Chapter 21 of the Book of the Damned. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Acacia Wood. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. Chapter 21. Knowledge, December 28, 1883. Seeing so many meteorological phenomena in your excellent paper Knowledge, I am tempted to ask for an explanation of the following, which I saw when on board the British India Company steamer Patna, while on a voyage up the Persian Gulf. In May 1880, on a dark night, about 11:30 p.m., there suddenly appeared on each side of the ship an enormous luminous wheel, whirling around, the spokes of which seemed to brush the ship along. The spokes would be 200 or 300 yards long, and resembled the birch rods of the dame schools. Each wheel contained about 16 spokes, and although the wheels must have been some 500 or 600 yards in diameter, the spokes could be distinctly seen all the way round. The phosphorescent gleam seemed to glide along flat on the surface of the sea, no light being visible in the air above the water. The appearance of the spokes could be almost exactly represented by standing in a boat and flashing a bull's-eye lantern horizontally along the surface of the water, round and round. I may mention the phenomena was also seen by Captain Avern of the Patna and Mr. Manning, third officer. Lee Force Brace. P.S. The wheels advanced along with the ship for about 20 minutes. LFB. Knowledge, January 11, 1884. Letter from A. McD. That Lee Force Brace, who sees so many meteorological phenomena in your excellent paper, should have signed himself the modern Ezekiel for his vision of wheels is quite as wonderful as the prophets. The writer then takes up the measurements that were given and calculates a velocity at the circumference of a wheel of about 166 yards per second, apparently considering that especially incredible. He then says, "From the nom de plume he assumes, it might be inferred that your correspondent is in the habit of sailing close to the wind." He asks permission to suggest an explanation of his own. It is that before 11:30 p.m. there had been numerous accidents to the main brace, and that it had required splicing so often that almost any ray of light would have taken on a rotary motion. In Knowledge, January 25, 1884, Mr. Brace answers and signs himself J.W. Robertson. I don't suppose A. McD. means any harm, but I do think it's rather unjust to say a man is drunk because he sees something out of the common. If there's one thing I pride myself upon, it's being able to say that never in my life have I indulged in anything stronger than water. From this curiosity of pride, he goes on to say that he had not intended to be exact, but to give his impressions of dimensions and velocity. He ends amiably, however, no offense taken, where I suppose none is meant. To this letter, Mr. Proctor adds a note apologizing for the publication of A. McD.'s letter, which had come about by a misunderstood instruction. Then Mr. Proctor wrote disagreeable letters himself about other persons.
What else would you expect in a quasi-existence? The obvious explanation of this phenomenon is that, under the surface of the sea, in the Persian Gulf, was a vast luminous wheel, that it was the light from its submerged spokes that Mr. Robertson saw shining upward. It seems clear that this light did shine upward from origin below the surface of the sea. But at first it is not so clear how vast luminous wheels, each the size of a village, ever got under the surface of the Persian Gulf. Also, there may be some misunderstanding as to what they were doing there. A deep-sea fish and its adaptation to a dense medium. That, at least in some regions aloft, there is a medium dense even to gelatinousness. A deep-sea fish brought to the surface of the ocean in a relatively attenuated medium, it disintegrates. Superconstructions adapted to a dense medium in interplanetary space. Sometimes, by stresses of various kinds, they are driven into this Earth's thin atmosphere. Later, we shall have data to support just this, that things entering this Earth's atmosphere disintegrate and shine with a light that is not the light of incandescence, shine brilliantly, even if cold. Vast wheel-like superconstructions. They enter this Earth's atmosphere and, threatened with disintegration, plunge for relief into an ocean or into a denser medium. Of course, the requirements now facing us are not only data of vast wheel-like superconstructions that have relieved their distresses in the ocean, but data of enormous wheels that have been seen in the air, or entering the ocean, or rising from the ocean and continuing their voyages. Very largely, we shall concern ourselves with enormous fiery objects that have either plunged into the ocean or risen from the ocean. Our acceptance is that, though disruption may intensify into incandescence, apart from disruption and its probable fieriness, things that enter this Earth's atmosphere have a cold light which would not, like light from molten matter, be instantly quenched by water. Also, it seems acceptable that a revolving wheel would, from a distance, look like a globe, that a revolving wheel seen relatively close by looks like a wheel in few aspects. The mergers of ball lightning and meteorites are not resistances to us. Our data are of enormous bodies. So we shall interpret. And what does it matter? Our attitude throughout this book, that here are extraordinary data, that they never would be exhumed and never would be massed together unless... Here are the data. Our first datum is of something that was once seen to enter an ocean. It's from the Puritanic publication Science, which has yielded us little material, or which, like most Puritans, does not go upon a spree very often. Whatever the thing could have been, my impression is of tremendousness, or of bulk many times that of all meteorites in all museums combined. Also of relative slowness, or of long warning of approach. The story in Science 5-242 is from an account sent to the Hydrographic Office at Washington from the branch office at San Francisco. That at midnight, February 24, 1885, latitude 37 degrees north and longitude 170 degrees east, or somewhere between Yokohama and Victoria, the captain of the bark Innerwich was aroused by his mate, who had seen something unusual in the sky. This must have taken appreciable time. The captain went on deck and saw the sky turning fiery red. All at once, a large mass of fire appeared over the vessel, completely blinding the spectators. The fiery mass fell into the sea. Its size may be judged by the volume of water cast up by it, said to have rushed toward the vessel with a noise that was deafening. The bark was struck flat aback, and a roaring white sea passed ahead. The master, an old, experienced mariner, declared that the awfulness of the sight was beyond description. In Nature 37-187 and L'Astronomie 1887-76, we are told that an object, described as a large ball of fire, was seen to rise from the sea near Cape Race. We are told that it rose to a height of 50 feet and then advanced close to the ship, then moving away, remaining visible about 5 minutes. The supposition in Nature is that it was ball lightning, but Flammarion, Thunder and Lightning, page 68, says that it was enormous. Details in the American Meteorological Journal 6/443, November 12, 1887, British steamer Siberian, that the object had moved against the wind before retreating. That Captain Moore said that at about the same place he had seen such appearances before. Report of the British Association, 1861-30. That, upon June 18, 1845, according to the Malta Times, from the brig Victoria, about 900 miles east of Adalia, Asia Minor, 36 degrees, 40 minutes, 56 seconds north, latitude 13 degrees, 44 minutes, 36 seconds east, longitude, 3 luminous bodies were seen to issue from the sea at about half a mile from the vessel. They were visible about 10 minutes. The story was never investigated, but other accounts that seem acceptably to be other observations upon this same sensational spectacle came in, as if of their own accord, and were published by Professor Baden-Powell. One is a letter from a correspondent at Mount Lebanon. He describes only 2 luminous bodies. Apparently they were 5 times the size of the moon, each had appendages, or they were connected by parts that are described as sail-like or streamer-like, looking like large flags blown out by a gentle breeze. The important point here is not only suggestion of structure, but duration. The duration of meteors is a few seconds. Duration of 15 seconds is remarkable, but I think there are records up to half a minute. This object, if it were all one object, was visible at Mount Lebanon about 1 hour. An interesting circumstance is that the appendages did not look like trains of meteors, which shine by their own light, but seemed to shine by light from the main bodies. About 900 miles west of the position of the Victoria is the town of Adalia, Asia Minor. At about the time of the observation reported by the captain of the Victoria, the Reverend F. Hallett, F.R.A.S., was in Adalia. He too saw this spectacle, and sent an account to Professor Baden-Powell. In his view, it was a body that appeared and then broke up. He placed his duration at 20 minutes to half an hour. In the report of the British Association, 1860-82, the phenomenon was reported from Syria and Malta as 2 very large bodies nearly joined. Report of the British Association, 1860-77. That, at Cherbourg, France, January 12, 1836, was seen a luminous body seemingly 2/3 the size of the moon. It seemed to rotate on an axis. Central to it there seemed to be a dark cavity. For other accounts, all indefinite, but distortable into data of wheel-like objects in the sky, see Nature, 22/617, London Times, October 15, 1859, Nature, 21/225, Monthly Weather Review, 1883, 264. L'Astronomie, 1894, 157. That, upon the morning of December 20th, 1893, an appearance in the sky was seen by many persons in Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. A luminous body passed overhead, from west to east, until at about 15 degrees in the eastern horizon it appeared to stand still for 15 or 20 minutes. According to some descriptions, it was the size of a table. To some observers it looked like an enormous wheel. The light was a brilliant white. Acceptably, it was not an optical illusion. The noise of its passage through the air was heard. Having been stationary, or having seemed to stand still 15 or 20 minutes, it disappeared, or exploded. No sound of explosion was heard. Vast wheel-like constructions. They're especially adapted to roll through a gelatinous medium from planet to planet. Sometimes, because of miscalculations, or because of stresses of various kinds, they enter this Earth's atmosphere. They're likely to explode. They have to submerge in the sea. They stay in the sea a while, revolving with relative leisureliness until relieved, and then emerge, sometimes close to vessels. Seamen tell of what they see. Their reports are interred in scientific morgues. I should say that the general route of these constructions is along latitudes not far from the latitudes of the Persian Gulf. Journal of the Royal Meteorological Society, 2829. that upon April 4, 1901, about 8:30, in the Persian Gulf, Captain Hoseason of the steamship Kilwa, according to a paper read before the Society by Captain Hoseason, was sailing in a sea in which there was no phosphorescence, there being no phosphorescence in the water. I suppose I'll have to repeat that. There being no phosphorescence in the water. Vast shafts of light, though the captain uses the word ripples, suddenly appeared. Shaft followed shaft upon the surface of the sea. But it was only a faint light, and in about 15 minutes died out, having appeared suddenly, having died out gradually. The shafts revolved at a velocity of about 60 miles an hour. Phosphorescent jellyfish correlate with the old dominant. In one of the most heroic compositions of disregards in our experience, it was agreed, in the discussion of Captain Hoseason's paper, that the phenomenon was probably pulsations of long strings of jellyfish. Nature, 21/410, reprint of a letter from R.E. Harris, commander of the A.H.N. Company steamship Shajihan, to the Calcutta Englishman, January 21st, 1880. That upon the 5th of June, 1880, off the coast of Malabar, at 10 p.m., water calm, sky cloudless, he had seen something that was so foreign to anything that he had ever seen before that he had stopped his ship. He saw what he describes as waves of brilliant light, with spaces between. Upon the water were floating patches of a substance that was not identified. Thinking in terms of the conventional explanation of all phosphorescence at sea, the captain at first suspected this substance. However, he gives his opinion that it did no illuminating but was, with the rest of the sea, illuminated by tremendous shafts of light. Whether it was a thick and oily discharge from the engine of a submerged construction or not, I think that I shall have to accept this substance as a concomitant, because of another note. As wave succeeded wave, one of the most grand and brilliant, yet solemn spectacles that one could think of, was here witnessed. Journal of the Royal Meteorological Society, 32/280. Extract from a letter from Mr. Douglas Carnegie, Blackheath, England. Date sometime in 1906. This last voyage we witnessed a weird and most extraordinary electric display. In the Gulf of Oman he saw a bank of apparently quiescent phosphorescence, but, when within 20 yards of it, shafts of brilliant light came sweeping across the ship's bows at a prodigious speed, which might be put down as anything between 60 and 200 miles an hour. These light bars were about 20 feet apart and most regular. As to phosphorescence, I collected a bucketful of water and examined it under the microscope, but could not detect anything abnormal. That the shafts of light came up from something beneath the surface. They first struck us on our broadsides, and I noticed that an intervening ship had no effect on the light beams. They started away from the lee side of the ship, just as if they had traveled right through it. The Gulf of Oman is at the entrance to the Persian Gulf. Journal of the Royal Meteorological Society, 33/294. Extract from a letter by Mr. S.C. Patterson, second officer of the P&O steamship Delta, a spectacle which the journal continues to call phosphorescent. Malacca Strait, 2 a.m., March 14, 1907. Shafts which seem to move round a center, like the spokes of a wheel, and appeared to be about 300 yards long. The phenomenon lasted about half an hour, during which time the ship had traveled 6 or 7 miles. It stopped suddenly. L'Astronomie, 1891, 312. A correspondent writes that, in October 1891, in the China Sea, he had seen shafts or lances of light that had had the appearance of rays of a searchlight, and that had moved like such rays. Nature, 20/291. Report to the Admiralty by Captain Evans, the hydrographer of the British Navy. That Commander J. E. Pringle of H.M.S. Vulture had reported that, at latitude 26 degrees 26 minutes north, and longitude 53 degrees 11 minutes east in the Persian Gulf, May 15, 1879, he had noticed luminous waves or pulsations in the water, moving at great speed. This time we have a definite datum upon origin somewhere below the surface. It is said that these waves of light passed under the Vulture. On looking toward the east, the appearance was that of a revolving wheel with a center on that bearing, and whose spokes were illuminated, and looking toward the west, a similar wheel appeared to be revolving, but in the opposite direction. Or finally, as to submergence, these waves of light extended from the surface well under the water. It is Commander Pringle's opinion that the shafts constituted one wheel, and that doubling was an illusion. He judges the shafts to have been about 25 feet broad, and the spaces about 100. Velocity about 84 miles an hour. Duration about 35 minutes. Time 9:40 p.m. Before and after this display, the ship had passed through patches of floating substance described as oily-looking fish spawn. Upon page 428 of this number of Nature, E. L. Maw says that, in April 1875, when upon HMS Bulldog, a few miles north of Vera Cruz, he had seen a series of swift lines of light. He had dipped up some of the water, finding in it an animalcule, which would, however, not account for phenomena of geometric formation and high velocity. If he means Vera Cruz, Mexico, this is the only instance we have out of Oriental waters. Scientific American, 106/51, that, in the Nautical Meteorological Annual, published by the Danish Meteorological Institute, appears a report upon a singular phenomenon that was seen by Captain Gabe, of the Danish East Asiatic Company steamship Bintang. At 3 a.m., June 10, 1909, while sailing through the Straits of Malacca, Captain Gabe saw a vast revolving wheel of light, flat upon the water, long arms issuing from a center around which the whole system appeared to rotate. So vast was the appearance that only half of it could be seen at a time, the center lying near the horizon. This display lasted about 15 minutes. Heretofore, we have not been clear upon the important point that forward motions of these wheels do not synchronize with a vessel's motions, and freaks of disregard, or rather, commonplaces of disregard, might attempt to assimilate with lights of a vessel. This time we are told that the vast wheel moved forward, decreasing in brilliancy and also in speed of rotation, disappearing when the center was right ahead of the vessel. Or my own interpretation would be that the source of light was submerging deeper and deeper and slowing down because meeting more and more resistance. The Danish Meteorological Institute reports another instance, that when Captain Breyer of the Dutch steamship Valentin was in the South China Sea, midnight, August 12, 1910, he saw a rotation of flashes. It looked like a horizontal wheel, turning rapidly. This time it is said that the appearance was above water. The phenomenon was observed by the captain, the first and second mates, and the first engineer, and upon all of them it made a somewhat uncomfortable impression. In general, if our expression be not immediately acceptable, we recommend to rival interpreters that they consider the localization, with one exception, of this phenomenon, to the Indian Ocean and adjacent waters, or Persian Gulf on one side and China Sea on the other side. Though we're intermediatists, the call of attempted positivism in the aspect of completeness is irresistible. We have expressed that from few aspects would wheels of fire in the air look like wheels of fire, but, if we can get it, we must have observation upon vast luminous wheels, not interpretable as optical illusions, but enormous, substantial things that have smashed down material resistances and have been seen to plunge into the ocean. Athenaeum, 1848, 833. That at the meeting of the British Association, 1848, Sir W. S. Harris said that he had recorded an account sent to him of a vessel toward which had whirled 2 wheels of fire, which the men described as rolling millstones of fire. When they came near, an awful crash took place. The topmasts were shivered to pieces. It is said that there was a strong sulphurous odor. End of chapter 21. Recording by Acacia Wood. Chapter 22 of the Book of the Damned. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Acacia Wood. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort.
Chapter 22 Journal of the Royal Meteorological Society, 1/157. Extract from the log of the bark Lady of the Lake, by Captain F. W. Banner. Communicated by R. H. Scott, F.R.S. That, upon the 22nd of March, 1870, at latitude 5 degrees 47 minutes north, longitude 27 degrees 52 minutes west, the sailors of the Lady of the Lake saw a remarkable object, or cloud, in the sky. They reported to the captain. According to Captain Banner, it was a cloud of circular form, with an included semicircle divided into 4 parts, the central dividing shaft beginning at the center of the circle and extending far outward and then curving backward. Geometricity and complexity and stability of form, and the small likelihood of a cloud maintaining such diversity of features, to say nothing of appearance of organic form. The thing traveled from a point at about 20 degrees above the horizon to a point about 80 degrees above. Then it settled down to the northeast, having appeared from the south-southeast. Light gray in color, or it was cloud color. It was much lower than the other clouds. And this datum stands out, that whatever it may have been, it traveled against the wind. It came up obliquely against the wind and finally settled down right in the wind's eye. For half an hour this form was visible. When it did finally disappear, that was not because it disintegrated like a cloud, but because it was lost to sight in the evening darkness. Captain Banner draws the following diagram. End of Chapter 22. Recording by Acacia Wood. Chapter 23 of the Book of the Damned. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Acacia Wood. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. Chapter 23. Textbooks tell us that the Dhurmsala meteorites were picked up soon, or within half an hour. Given a little time, the conventionalists may argue that these stones were hot when they fell, but that their great interior coldness had overcome the molten state of their surfaces. According to the Deputy Commissioner of Dhurmsala, these stones had been picked up immediately by passing coolies. These stones were so cold that they benumbed the fingers. But they had fallen with a great light. It is described as a flame of fire about 2 feet in depth and 9 feet in length. Acceptably, this light was not the light of molten matter. In this chapter we are very intermediatistic and unsatisfactory. To the intermediatist there is but one answer to all questions. Sometimes, and sometimes not. Another form of this intermediatist solution of all problems is yes and no. Everything that is, also isn't. A positivist attempts to formulate. So does the intermediatist, but with less rigorousness. He accepts, but also denies. He may seem to accept in one respect and deny in some other respect, but no real line can be drawn between any two aspects of anything. The intermediatist accepts that which seems to correlate with something that he has accepted as dominant. The positivist correlates with the belief. In the Dhurmsala meteorites, we have support for our expression that things entering this Earth's atmosphere sometimes shine with a light that is not the light of incandescence. Or so we account, or offer an expression upon, thunderstones, or carved stones that have fallen luminously to this earth in streaks that have looked like strokes of lightning, but we accept also that some things that have entered this Earth's atmosphere disintegrate with the intensity of flame and molten matter. But some things we accept enter this Earth's atmosphere and collapse non-luminously, quite like deep sea fishes brought to the surface of the ocean. Whatever agreement we have is an indication that somewhere aloft there is a medium denser than this Earth's atmosphere. I suppose our stronghold is in that such is not popular belief, or the rhythm of all phenomena,
air dense at sea level upon this earth, less and less dense as one ascends, then denser and denser. A good many bothersome questions arise. Our attitude. Here are the data. Luminous rains sometimes fall. Nature, March 9, 1882. Nature, 25/437. This is light that is not the light of incandescence, but no one can say that these occasional or rare rains come from this Earth's externality. We simply note cold light of falling bodies. For luminous rain, snow, and dust, see Hartwig, Area World, page 319. As to luminous clouds, we have more nearly definite observations and opinions. They mark transition between the old dominant and the new dominant. We have already noted the transition in Professor Schwedoff's theory of external origin of some hailstones, and the implications that, to a former generation, seem so preposterous, droll was the word, that there are in interplanetary regions volumes of water, whether they have fishes and frogs in them or not. Now our acceptance is that clouds sometimes come from external regions, having had origin from supergeographical lakes and oceans that we shall not attempt to chart just at present, only suggesting to enterprising aviators, and we note that we put it all up to them, and show no inclination to go Columbusing on our own account, that they take bathing suits, or rather deep-sea diving suits, along. So then that some clouds come from interplanetary oceans, of the Super Sargasso Sea, if we still accept the Super Sargasso Sea, and shine upon entering this Earth's atmosphere. In Himmel und Erde, February 1889, a phenomenon of transition of 30 years ago, Herr O. Jesse, in his observations upon luminous night clouds, notes the great height of them, and drolly or sensibly suggests that some of them may have come from regions external to this Earth. I suppose he means only from other planets, but it's a very droll and sensible idea either way. In general, I am accounting for a great deal of this Earth's isolation, that it is relatively isolated by circumstances that are similar to the circumstances that make for relative isolation of the bottom of the ocean, except that there is a clumsiness of analogy now. To call ourselves deep-sea fishes has been convenient, but in a quasi-existence there is no convenience that will not sooner or later turn awkward. So, if there be denser regions aloft, these regions should now be regarded as analogues of far submerged oceanic regions, and things coming to this earth would be like things rising to an attenuated medium, and exploding, sometimes incandescently, sometimes with cold light, sometimes non-luminously, like deep-sea fishes brought to the surface. Altogether conditions of inhospitality. I have a suspicion that, in their own depths, deep-sea fishes are not luminous. If they are, Darwinism is mere Jesuitism in attempting to correlate them. Such advertising would so attract attention that all advantages would be more than offset. Darwinism is largely a doctrine of concealment. Here we have brazen proclamation, if accepted. Fishes in the Mammoth Cave need no light to see by. We might have an expression that deep-sea fishes turn luminous upon entering a less dense medium, but models in the American Museum of Natural History specialized organs of luminosity upon these models. Of course, we do remember that awfully convincing Dodo, and some of our sophistications we trace to him. At any rate, disruption is regarded as a phenomenon of coming from a dense to a less dense medium. An account by M. Macarius in the Transactions of the Swedish Academy of Sciences, 1808-215, translated for the North American Review, 3/319, that M. Macarius, having heard of an extraordinary and probably hitherto unseen phenomenon, reported from near the town of Skänning, Sweden, investigated. That upon the 16th of May, 1808, at about 4 p.m., the sun suddenly turned dull brick red. At the same time there appeared upon the western horizon a great number of round bodies, dark brown, and seemingly the size of a hat crown. They passed overhead and disappeared in the eastern horizon. Tremendous procession! It lasted 2 hours. Occasionally one fell to the ground. When the place of a fall was examined, there was found a film, which soon dried and vanished. Often when approaching the sun, these bodies seemed to link together, or were then seen to be linked together in groups not exceeding 8, and under the sun they were seen to have tails 3 or 4 fathoms long. Away from the sun the tails were invisible. Whatever their substance may have been, it is described as gelatinous, soapy, and jellied. I place this datum here for several reasons. It would have been a good climax to our expression upon hordes of small bodies that, in our acceptance, were not seeds, nor birds, nor ice crystals. But the tendency would have been to jump to the homogeneous conclusion that all our data in that expression related to this one kind of phenomena, whereas we conceive of infinite heterogeneity of the external, of crusaders and rabbles and immigrants and tourists and dragons and things like gelatinous hat crowns. Or that all things here upon this earth that flock together are not necessarily sheep, Presbyterians, gangsters, or porpoises. The datum is important to us here as indication of disruption in this earth's atmosphere, dangers in entering this earth's atmosphere. I think myself that thousands of objects have been seen to fall from aloft and have exploded luminously and have been called ball lightning. As to what ball lightning is, we have not yet begun to make intelligent guesses. Monthly Weather Review, 3417. In general, it seems to me that when we encounter the opposition ball lightning, we should pay little attention, but confine ourselves to guesses that are at least intelligent, that stand phantom-like in our way. We note here that in some of our acceptances upon intelligence, we should more clearly have pointed out that they were upon the intelligent as opposed to the instinctive. In the Monthly Weather Review 33409, there is an account of ball lightning that struck a tree. It made a dent, such as a falling object would make. Some other time I shall collect instances of ball lightning to express that they are instances of objects that have fallen from the sky luminously, exploding terrifically. So bewildered is the old orthodoxy by these phenomena that many scientists have either denied ball lightning or have considered it very doubtful. I refer to Dr. Seister's list of 150 instances which he considered authentic. In accord with our disaccord is an instance related in the Monthly Weather Review, March 1887, something that fell luminously from the sky, accompanied by something that was not so affected, or that was dark. That, according to Captain C.D. Sweet of the Dutch bark JPA, upon March 19, 1887, north 37 degrees 39 minutes, west 57 degrees 00 minutes, he encountered a severe storm. He saw 2 objects in the air above the ship. One was luminous, and might be explained in several ways, but the other was dark. One or both fell into the sea with a roar and a casting up of billows. It is our acceptance that these things had entered this earth's atmosphere, having first crashed through a field of ice. Immediately afterward, lumps of ice fell. One of the most astonishing of the phenomena of ball lightning is a phenomenon of many meteorites, violence of explosion out of all proportion to size and velocity. We accept that the icy meteorites of Dhurmsala could have fallen with no great velocity, but the sound from them was tremendous. The soft substance that fell at the Cape of Good Hope was carbonaceous, but was unburned, or had fallen with velocity insufficient to ignite it. The tremendous report that it made was heard over an area more than 70 miles in diameter. That some hailstones have been formed in a dense medium and violently disintegrate in this Earth's relatively thin atmosphere. Nature, 88, 350. Large hailstones noted at the University of Missouri, November 11, 1911. They exploded with sounds like pistol shots. The writer says that he had noticed a similar phenomenon 18 years before at Lexington, Kentucky. Hailstones that seemed to have been formed in a denser medium. When melted underwater, they gave out bubbles larger than their central air spaces. Monthly Weather Review, 33-445. Our acceptance is that many objects have fallen from the sky, but that many of them have disintegrated violently. This acceptance will coordinate with data still to come, but also we make it easy for ourselves in our expressions upon superconstructions, if we're asked why, from thinkable wrecks of them, girders, plates, or parts recognizably of manufactured metal have not fallen from the sky. However, as to composition, we have not this refuge, so it is our expression that there have been reported instances of the fall of manufactured metal from the sky. The meteorite of Rutherford, North Carolina, is of artificial material, mass of pig iron. It is said to be fraudulent. American Journal of Science 2/34-298. The object that was said to have fallen at Marblehead, Massachusetts in 1858 is described in the American Journal of Science 2/34-135 as a furnace product formed in smelting copper ores or iron ores containing copper. It is said to be fraudulent. According to Ehrenberg, the substance reported by Captain Callum to have fallen upon his vessel near Java offered complete resemblance to the residue resulting from combustion of a steel wire in a flask of oxygen. Zerker, Meteors, page 239. Nature, November 21, 1878, publishes a notice that, according to the Yuma Sentinel, a meteorite that resembles steel had been found in the Mojave Desert. In Nature, February 15, 1894, we read that one of the meteorites brought to the United States by Peary from Greenland is of tempered steel. The opinion is that meteoric iron had fallen in water or snow, quickly cooling and hardening. This does not apply to composition. November 5, 1898, Nature publishes a notice of a paper by Professor Berworth of Vienna upon the close connection between meteoric iron and steelwork steel. At the meeting of November 24, 1906, of the Essex Field Club, was exhibited a piece of metal said to have fallen from the sky October 9, 1906, at Braintree. According to the Essex naturalist, Dr. Fletcher of the British Museum had declared this metal to be smelted iron, so that the mystery of its reported fall remained unexplained. End of chapter 23. Recording by Acacia Wood. Chapter 24 of the Book of the Damned. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Acacia Wood. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. Chapter 24. We shall have an outcry of silences. If a single instance of anything be disregarded by a system, our own attitude is that a single instance is a powerless thing. Of course, our own method of agreement of many instances is not a real method. In continuity, all things must have resemblances with all other things. Anything has any quasi-identity you please. Some time ago, conscription was assimilated with either autocracy or democracy with equal facility. Note the need for a dominant to correlate to. Scarcely anybody said simply that we must have conscription, but that we must have conscription which correlates with democracy, which was taken as a base, or something basically desirable. Of course, between autocracy and democracy nothing but false demarcation can be drawn. So, I can conceive of no subject upon which there should be such poverty as a single instance, if anything one pleases can be whipped into line. However, we shall try to be more nearly real than the Darwinites who advance concealing coloration as Darwinism and then drag in proclaiming luminosity, too, as Darwinism. I think the Darwinites had better come in with us as to the deep-sea fishes, and be sorry later, I suppose. It will be amazing or negligible to read all the instances now to come of things that have been seen in the sky, and to think that all have been disregarded. My own opinion is that it is not possible, or very easy, to disregard them, now that they have been brought together, but that if prior to about this time we had attempted such an assemblage, the old dominant would have withered our typewriter. As it is, the letter E has gone back on us, and the S is temperamental. Most extraordinary and singular phenomenon, North Wales, August 26, 1894. a disk from which projected an orange-colored body that looked like an elongated flatfish, reported by Admiral Amani, Nature 50/524. Disk from which projected a hook-like form, India, about 1838. Diagram of it given. Disk about size of the moon, but brighter than the moon, visible about 20 minutes, by G. Petit in Professor Baden-Powell's catalogue, reported the British Association, 1849. Very brilliant hook-like form seen in the sky at Poland, Trumbull Company, Ohio, during the stream of meteors of 1833. Visible more than an hour. Large luminous body almost stationary, for a time, shaped like a square table. Niagara Falls, November 13, 1833. American Journal of Science, 125/391. Something described as a bright white cloud at night, November 3, 1886, at Hamar, Norway. From it were emitted brilliant rays of light, drifted across the sky, retained throughout its original form. Nature, December 16, 1886, 158. Thing with an oval nucleus and streamers with dark bands and lines, very suggestive of structure. New Zealand, May 4, 1888. Nature, 42/402. Luminous object size of full moon visible an hour and a half. Chile, November 5, 1883. Comptes Rendus, 103/682. Bright object near sun, December 21, 1882. Knowledge, 313. Light that looked like a great flame far out at sea off Ryukyu, Q, December 2, 1845. London Royal Society Proceedings, 5/627. Something like a gigantic trumpet, suspended, vertical, oscillating gently, visible 5 or 6 minutes, length estimated at 425 feet, at Oaxaca, Mexico, July 6, 1874. Scientific American Supplement 6, 2365. 2 luminous bodies, seemingly united, visible 5 or 6 minutes, June 3, 1898. La Nature, 1898, 1/127. Thing with a tail, crossing moon, transit half a minute, September 26, 1870. London Times, September 30, 1870. Object 4 or 5 times size of moon, moving slowly across sky, November 1, 1885, near Adrianople. L'Astronomie, 1886, 309. Large body, colored red, moving slowly, visible 15 minutes, reported by Caggia, Marseille, August 1, 1871. Chemistry News, 24/193. Details of this observation and similar observation by Guillemin, and other instances by de Fonville, Comptes Rendus, 73/297, 755. Thing that was large and that was stationary twice in 7 minutes, Oxford, November 19, 1847, listed by Lowe. Rex I, 1/136. Grayish object that looked to be about 3½ feet long, rapidly approaching the Earth at Saarbrück, April 1, 1826. Sound like thunder, object expanding like a sheet. American Journal of Science, 1/26/133. Quarterly Journal of the Royal Institute, 24/488. Report by an astronomer, N.S. Drayton, upon an object duration of which seemed to him extraordinary. Duration 3/4 of a minute. Jersey City, July 6, 1882. Scientific American, 47/53. Object like a comet, but with proper motion of 10 degrees an hour, visible 1 hour, reported by Purin and Glancy from the Cordoba Observatory, Argentina, March 14, 1916, Scientific American, 115/493. Something like a signal light, reported by Glacier, October 4, 1844, bright as Jupiter, sending out quick flickering waves of light. Yearbook of Facts, 1845, 278. I think that with the object known as Eddie's Comet passes away the last of our susceptibility to the common fallacy of personifying. It is one of the most deep-rooted of positivist illusions, that people are persons. We have been guilty too often of spleens and spites and ridicules against astronomers, as if they were persons or final unities, individuals, completenesses or selves, instead of indeterminate parts. But, so long as we remain in quasi-existence, we can cast out illusion only with some other illusion, though the other illusion may approximate higher to reality. So we personify no more, but we super-personify. We now take into full acceptance our expression that development is an autocracy of successive dominants, which are not final, but which approximate higher to individuality or selfness than do the human tropisms that irresponsibly correlate to them. Eddy reported a celestial object from the observatory at Grahamstown, South Africa. It was in 1890. The new dominant was only heir presumptive then, or heir apparent, but not obvious. The thing that Eddy reported might as well have been reported by a night watchman who had looked up through an unplaced sewer pipe. It did not correlate. The thing was not admitted to monthly notices. I think myself that if the editor had attempted to let it in, earthquake, or a mysterious fire in his publishing house. The dominants are jealous gods. In nature, presumably a vassal of the new god, though of course also plausibly rendering homage to the old, is reported a comet-like body of October 27, 1890, observed at Grahamstown by Eddy. It may have looked comet-like, but it moved 100 degrees while visible, or 100 degrees in 3/4 of an hour. See Nature 438990. In Nature 44/519, Professor Copeland describes a similar appearance that he had seen September 10, 1891. Dreyer says, Nature 44/541, that he had seen this object at the Armagh Observatory. He likens it to the object that was reported by Eddy. It was seen by Dr. Alexander Graham Bell September 11, 1891, in Nova Scotia. But the old dominant was a jealous god. So there were different observations upon something that was seen in November 1883. These observations were Philistines in 1883. In the American Meteorologic Journal 1/110, a correspondent reports having seen an object like a comet with two tails, one up and one down, November 10th or 12th, 1883. Very likely this phenomenon should be placed in our expression upon torpedo-shaped bodies that have been seen in the sky, our data upon dirigibles or super zeppelins, but our attempted classifications are far from rigorous, or are mere gropes. In the Scientific American 50/40, a correspondent writes from Humaco, Puerto Rico, that November 21st, 1883, he and several other persons, or persons as it were, had seen a majestic appearance like a comet, visible 3 successive nights, disappeared then. The editor says that he can offer no explanation. If accepted, this thing must have been close to the Earth. If it had been a comet, it would have been seen widely, and the news would have been telegraphed over the world, says the editor. Upon page 97 of this volume of the Scientific American, a correspondent writes that at Sulphur Springs, Ohio, he had seen a wonder in the sky at about the same date. It was torpedo-shaped, or something with a nucleus, at each end of which was a tail. Again, the editor says that he can offer no explanation, that the object was not a comet. He associates it with the atmospheric effects general in 1883. But it will be our expression that in England and Holland a similar object was seen in November 1882. In the Scientific American 4294 is published a letter from Henry Harrison of Jersey City, copied from the New York Tribune, that upon the evening of April 13, 1879, Mr. Harrison was searching for Brorson's comet when he saw an object that was moving so rapidly that it could not have been a comet. He called a friend to look, and his observation was confirmed. At 2 o'clock in the morning, this object was still visible. In the Scientific American Supplement 7, 2008-85, Mr. Harrison disclaims sensationalism, which he seems to think unworthy, and gives technical details. He says that the object was seen by Mr. J. Spencer DeVoe of Manhattanville. End of Chapter 24. Recording by Acacia Wood.
Chapter 25 of the Book of the Damned. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. Chapter 25. a formation having the shape of a dirigible. It was reported from Huntington, West Virginia. Luminous object that was seen July 19, 1916, at about 11 p.m. Observed through, quote, rather powerful field glasses. It looked to be about 2 degrees long and a half a degree wide. It gradually dimmed, disappeared, reappeared, and then faded out of sight. Another person, as we say, it would be too inconvenient to hold our intermediatist recognitions. Another person who observed this phenomenon suggested to the writer of the account that the object was a dirigible, but the writer says that faint stars could be seen behind it. This would seem really to oppose our notion of a dirigible visitor to this earth, except for the inconclusiveness of all things in a mode of seeming that is not final. Or we suggest that behind some parts of the object, thing, construction, faint stars were seen. We find a slight discussion here. Professor H.M. Russell thinks that the phenomenon was a detached cloud of aurora borealis. Upon page 369 of this volume of the Scientific American, another correlator suggests that it was a light from a blast furnace. Disregarding that, if there be blast furnaces in or near Huntington, their reflections would be commonplace there. We now have several observations upon cylindrical-shaped bodies that have appeared in this Earth's atmosphere. Cylindrical, but pointed at both ends or torpedo-shaped. Some of the accounts are not very detailed, but out of the bits of description my own acceptance is that supergeographical routes are traversed by torpedo-shaped superconstructions that have occasionally visited, or that have occasionally been driven into, this Earth's atmosphere. From data, the acceptance is that upon entering this Earth's atmosphere, these vessels have been so racked that they have not sailed away. Disintegration would have occurred. That, before leaving this Earth, they have, whether in attempted communication or not, or in mere wantonness or not, dropped objects which did almost immediately violently disintegrate or explode. Upon general principles, we think that explosives have not been purposely dropped, but that parts have been racked off and have fallen, exploding like the things called ball lightning. Many have been objects of stone or metal with inscriptions upon them, for all we know, at present. In all instances, estimates of dimensions are valueless, but ratios of dimensions are more acceptable. A thing said to have been 6 feet long may have been 600 feet long, but shape is not so subject to the illusion of distance. Nature 40, 415. That, August 5, 1889, during a violent storm, an object that looked to be about 15 inches long and 5 inches wide fell, rather slowly, at East Twickenham, England. It exploded. No substance from it was found. L'Année Scientifique, 1864, 54. That, October 10, 1864, Monsieur Leverrier had sent to the Academy 3 letters from witnesses of a long luminous body, tapering at both ends, that had been seen in the sky. In Thunder and Lightning, page 87, Flammarion says that on August 20th, 1880, during a rather violent storm, M.A. Trécoul of the French Academy saw a very brilliant yellowish-white body, apparently 35 to 40 centimeters long and about 25 centimeters wide, torpedo-shaped, or a cylindrical body, quote, with slightly conical ends. It dropped something and disappeared in the clouds. Whatever it may have been that was dropped, it fell vertically like a heavy object and left a luminous train. The scene of this occurrence may have been far from the observer. No sound was heard. For M. Trécoul's account, see Comptes Rendus 103-849. Monthly Weather Review, 1907, 310. That, July 2nd, 1907, in the town of Burlington, Vermont, a terrific explosion had been heard throughout the city. A ball of light or a luminous object had been seen to fall from the sky, or from a torpedo-shaped thing or construction in the sky. No one had seen this thing, that had exploded fall from a larger body that was in the sky, but if we accept that at the same time there was a larger body in the sky, my own acceptance is that a dirigible in the sky, or a construction that showed every sign of disrupting, had barely time to drop, whatever it did drop, and to speed away to safety above. The following story is told in the review by Bishop John S. Michaud. Quote, I was standing on the corner of Church and College Streets, just in front of the Howard Bank, and facing east, engaged in conversation with ex-Governor Woodbury and Mr. A. Buell, when, without the slightest indication or warning, we were startled by what sounded like a most unusual and terrific explosion, evidently very nearby. Raising my eyes, and looking eastward along College Street, I observed a torpedo-shaped body some 300 feet away, stationary in appearance, and suspended in the air about 50 feet above the tops of the buildings. In size, it was about 6 feet long by 8 inches in diameter. The shell, or covering, having a dark appearance with here and there tongues of fire issuing from spots on the surface, resembling red-hot unburnished copper. Although stationary when first noticed, this object soon began to move rather slowly, and disappeared over Dolan Brothers' store, southward. As it moved, the covering seemed rupturing in places, and through these the intensely red flames issued. End quote. Bishop Michaud attempts to correlate it with meteorological observations. Because of the nearby view, this is perhaps the most remarkable of the new correlates, but the correlate now coming is extraordinary because of the great number of recorded observations upon it. My own acceptance is that upon November 17, 1882, a vast dirigible crossed England, but by the definiteness, indefiniteness of all things quasi-real, some observations upon it can be correlated with anything one pleases. E.W. Maunder, invited by the editors of the Observatory to write some reminiscences for the 500th number of their magazine, gives one that he says stands out. It is upon something that he terms, quote, a strange celestial visitor. Maunder was at the Royal Observatory, Greenwich, November 17, 1882, at night. There was an aurora without features of special interest. In the midst of the aurora, a great circular disk of greenish light appeared and moved smoothly across the sky. But the circularity was evidently the effect of foreshortening. The thing passed above the moon and was, by other observers, described as cigar-shaped, like a torpedo, a spindle, a shuttle. The idea of foreshortening is not mine. Maunder says this. He says, quote, had the incident occurred a third of a century later, beyond doubt everyone would have selected the same simile. It would have been, quote, just like a zeppelin, end quote. The duration was about 2 minutes. Color said to have been the same as that of the auroral glow in the north. Nevertheless, Maunder says that this thing had no relation to the auroral phenomena. Quote, it appeared to be a definite body, end quote. Motion too fast for a cloud, but, quote, nothing could be more unlike the rush of a meteor, end quote. In the Philosophical Magazine, 5/15/318, J. Rand Capron, in a lengthy paper, alludes throughout to this phenomenon as in, quote, auroral beam, end quote. But he lists many observations upon its, quote, torpedo shape, and one observation upon a, quote, dark nucleus in it. Host of most confusing observations. Estimates of height between 40 and 200 miles. Observations in Holland and Belgium. We are told that, according to Capron's spectroscopic observations, the phenomenon was nothing but a beam of auroral light. In the Observatory, 6/192, is Maunder's contemporaneous account. He gives apparent approximate length and breadth at 27 degrees and 3 degrees and a half. He gives other observations seeming to indicate structure, quote, remarkable dark marking down the center, end quote. In Nature, 27/84, Capron says that because of the moonlight, He had been able to do little with the spectroscope. Color white, but aurora rosy. Nature 2787. Bright stars seen through it, but not at the zenith, where it looked opaque. This is the only assertion of transparency. Too slow for a meteor, but too fast for a cloud. Quote, surface had a mottled appearance. Quote, very definite in form like a torpedo. Quote, probably a meteoric object. Dr. Groneman. Technical demonstration by Dr. Groneman that it was a cloud of meteoric matter. See Nature 27, 315, 338, 365, 388, 412, and 434. Quote, very little doubt it was an electric phenomenon, end quote. Proctor, in Knowledge 2, 419. In the London Times, November 20th, 1882, the editor says that he had received a great number of letters upon this phenomenon. He publishes 2. One correspondent described it as, quote, well-defined and shaped like a fish, extraordinary and alarming, end quote. The other correspondent writes of it as, quote, a most magnificent luminous mass, shaped somewhat like a torpedo, end quote. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26. Notes and Queries 53306. About 8 lights that were seen in Wales over an area of about 8 miles, all keeping their own ground, whether moving together perpendicularly, horizontally, or over a zigzag course. They looked like electric lights, disappearing, reappearing dimly, then shining as bright as ever. Quote, we have seen them 3 or 4 at a time afterward on 4 or 5 occasions. London Times, October 5th, 1877. Quote, from time to time, the west coast of Wales seems to have been the scene of mysterious lights. And now we have a statement from Towyn that within the last few weeks, lights of various colors have been seen moving over the estuary of the Dasani River and out to sea. They are generally in a northerly direction, but sometimes they hug the shore and move at high velocity for miles towards Aberdovey and suddenly disappear. End quote. L'Année Scientifique, 1877, 45. Lights that appeared in the sky above Vos, France, March 23, 1877, described as balls of fire of dazzling brightness, appeared from a cloud about a degree in diameter, moving relatively slowly. They were visible more than an hour, moving northward. It is said that 8 or 10 years before, similar lights or objects had been seen in the sky at Vos. London Times, September 19th, 1848. That at Inverness, Scotland, 2 large bright lights that looked like stars had been seen in the sky, sometimes stationary, but occasionally moving at high velocity. L'Année Scientifique, 1888-66. Observed near St. Petersburg, July 30th, 1880, in the evening. A large spherical light and 2 smaller ones moving along a ravine. Visible 3 minutes, disappearing without noise. Nature 35, 173. That at Iloilo, September 30th, 1886, was seen a luminous object the size of the full moon. It, quote, floated slowly, quote, northward, followed by smaller ones close to it. The false lights of Durham. Every now and then in the English newspapers, in the middle of the 19th century, there is something about lights that were seen against the sky, but as if not far above land, oftenest upon the coast of Durham. They were mistaken for beacons by sailors. Wreck after wreck occurred. The fishermen were accused of displaying false lights and profiting by wreckage. The fishermen answered that mostly only old vessels, worthless except for insurance, were so wrecked. In 1866, from the London Times, popular excitement became intense. There was an investigation. Before a commission headed by Admiral Collinson, testimony was taken. One witness described the light that had deceived him as, quote, considerably elevated above ground. No conclusion was reached. The lights were called, quote, the mysterious lights. But whatever the, quote, false lights of Durham may have been, they were unaffected by the investigation. In 1867, the Tyne Pilotage Board took the matter up. Opinion of the Mayor of Tyne, a mysterious affair. In the Report of the British Association, 1877, 152, there is a description of a group of, quote, meteors that traveled with, quote, remarkable slowness. They were in sight about 3 minutes. Remarkable, it seems, is scarcely strong enough. One reads of remarkable as applied to a duration of 3 seconds. These meteors had another peculiarity. They left no train. They are described as, quote, seemingly huddled together like a flock of wild geese and moving with the same velocity and grace of regularity, end quote. Journal of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, November and December 1913. That, according to many observations collected by Professor Chant of Toronto, there appeared upon the night of February 9th, 1913, a spectacle that was seen in Canada, the United States, and at sea, and in Bermuda. A luminous body was seen. To it there was a long tail. The body grew rapidly larger. Quote, observers differ as to whether the body was single or was composed of 3 or 4 parts with a tail to each part, end quote. The group, or complex structure, moved with, quote, a peculiar, majestic deliberation. Quote, it disappeared in the distance, and another group emerged from its place of origin. Onward they moved at the same deliberate pace in 2s or 3s or 4s, end quote. They disappeared. A third group, or a third structure, followed. Some observers compared the spectacle to a fleet of airships, others to battleships attended by cruisers and destroyers. According to one writer, quote, there were probably 30 or 32 bodies, and the peculiar thing about them was their moving in 4s and 3s and 2s, abreast of one another, and so perfect was the lining up that you would have thought it was an aerial fleet maneuvering after rigid drilling. End quote. Nature, May 25th, 1893. A letter from Captain Charles J. Norcock of HMS Caroline. That upon the 24th of February, 1893, at 10 p.m., between Shanghai and Japan, the officer of the watch had reported, quote, some unusual lights. They were between the ship and a mountain. The mountain was about 6,000 feet high. The lights seemed to be globular. They moved sometimes massed, but sometimes strung out in an irregular line. They bore, quote, northward, until lost to sight. Duration, 2 hours. The next night the lights were seen again. They were for a time eclipsed by a small island. They bore north at about the same speed and in about the same direction as speed and direction of the Caroline. But they were lights that cast a reflection. There was a glare upon the horizon under them. A telescope brought out but few details, that they were reddish and seemed to emit a faint smoke. This time the duration was 7.5 hours. Then Captain Norcock says that in the same general locality, and at about the same time, Captain Castle of HMS Leander had seen the lights. He had altered his course and had made towards them. The lights had fled from him. At least they had moved higher in the sky. Monthly Weather Review, March 1904, 115. Reports from the observations of 3 members of his crew by Lieutenant Frank F. Schofield, United States Navy, of the USS Supply. February 24th, 1904. 3 luminous objects of different sizes, the largest having an apparent area of about 6 suns. When first sighted, they were not very high. They were below clouds of an estimated height of about 1 mile. They fled or evaded, or they turned. They went up into the clouds below which they had at first been sighted. Their unison of movement. But they were of different sizes, and of different susceptibilities to all forces of this earth and of the air. Monthly Weather Review, August, 1898, 358. 2 letters from C.N. Krotzenberg, Crow Agency, Montana. That, in the summer of 1896, when this writer was a railroad postal clerk, or one who was experienced in train phenomena, while his train was going, quote, northward, from Trenton, Montana, he and another clerk saw, in the darkness of a heavy rain, a light that appeared to be round and of a dull rose color, and seemed to be about a foot in diameter. It seemed to float within 100 feet of the earth, but soon rose high, or, quote, midway between horizon and zenith. The wind was quite strong from the east, but the light held a course almost due north. Its speed varied. Sometimes it seemed to outrun the train, quote, considerably. At other times it seemed to fall behind. The mail clerks watched until the town of Linville, Iowa, was reached. Behind the depot of this town, the light disappeared and was not seen again. All this time there had been rain, but very little lightning, but Mr. Krotzenberg offers the explanation that it was, quote, ball lightning. The editor of the review disagrees. He thinks that the light may have been a reflection from the rain, or fog, or from leaves of trees glistening with rain, or the train's light, but not lights. In the December number of the review is a letter from Edward M. Boggs, that the light was a reflection, perhaps from the glare, one light this time, from the locomotive's firebox, upon wet telegraph wires, an appearance that might not have been striated by the wires, but consolidated into one rotundity, that it had seemed to oscillate with the undulations of the wires, and had seemed to change horizontal distance with the varying angles of reflection, and had seemed to advance or fall behind when the train had rounded curves. All of which is typical of the best of quasi-reasoning. It includes and assimilates diverse data, but it excludes that which will destroy it. That, acceptably, the telegraph wires were alongside the track beyond as well as leading to Linville. Mr. Krotzenberg thinks of, quote, ball lightning, which, though a sore bewilderment to most speculation, is usually supposed to be a correlate with the old system of thought. But his awareness of, quote, something else is expressed in other parts of his letters, when he says that he has something to tell that is, quote, so strange that I should never have mentioned it, even to my friends, had it not been corroborated. So unreal that I hesitate to speak of it, fearing that it was some freak of the imagination. End quote. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Book of the Damned. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. Chapter 27. Vast and black. The thing that was poised like a crow over the moon. Round and smooth. Cannonballs. Things that have fallen from the sky to this earth. Are slippery brains. Things like cannonballs have fallen in storms upon this earth, like cannonballs are things that, in storms, have fallen to this earth. Showers of blood. Showers of blood. Showers of blood. Whatever it may have been, something like red brick dust or a red substance in a dried state, fell at Piedmont, Italy, October 27, 1814. A red powder fell in Switzerland, winter of 1867. That something far from this earth had bled, superdragon that had rammed a comet, or that there are oceans of blood somewhere in the sky, substances that dries and falls in a powder, wastes for ages in powdered form, that there is a vast area that will someday be known to aviators as the Desert of Blood. We attempt little of supertopography at present, but ocean of blood or desert of blood or both. Italy is nearest to it, or to them. I suspect that there were corpuscles in the substance that fell in Switzerland, but all that could be published in 1867 was that in this substance there was a high proportion of, quote, variously shaped organic matter. At Gießen, Germany, in 1821, according to the report of the British Association, fell a rain of a peach-red color. In this rain were flakes of hyacinth tint. It is said that this substance was organic. We are told that it was purine. But distinctly enough, we are told of one red rain that it was of corpuscular composition. Red snow, rather. It fell, March 12, 1876, near the Crystal Palace, London. As to the, quote, red snow of polar and mountainous regions, we have no opposition because that, quote, snow has never been seen to fall from the sky. It is a growth of microorganisms or of a protococcus that spreads over snow that is on the ground. This time nothing is said of, quote, sand from the Sahara. It is said of the red matter that fell in London, March 12, 1876, that it was composed of corpuscles. Of course, that they looked like, quote, vegetable cells. A note, that 9 days before had fallen the red substance, flesh, whatever it may have been, of Bath County, Kentucky. I think that a super-egotist, vast, but not so vast as it had supposed, had refused to move to one side for a comet. We summarize our general supergeographical expressions. Gelatinous regions, sulfurous regions, frigid and tropical regions, a region that has been source of life relatively to this earth, regions wherein there is density so great that things from them entering this earth's thin atmosphere exploded. We have had a datum of explosive hailstones. We now have support to the acceptance that they had been formed in a medium far denser than air of this earth at sea level. In the Popular Science News 2238 is an account of ice that had been formed under great pressure in the laboratory of the University of Virginia. When released and brought into contact with ordinary air, this ice exploded. And again the flesh-like substance that fell in Kentucky, its flake-like formation. Here is a phenomenon that is familiar to us. It suggests flattening under pressure. But the extraordinary inference is pressure not equal on all sides. In the Annual Record of Science, 1873, 350, it is said that, in 1873, after a heavy thunderstorm in Louisiana, a tremendous number of fish scales were found for a distance of 40 miles along the banks of the Mississippi River. Bushels of them picked up in a single place, large scales that were said to be of the garfish, a fish that weighs from 5 to 50 pounds. It seems impossible to accept this identification. One thinks of a substance that has been pressed into flakes or scales, and round hailstones with wide thin margins of ice irregularly around them. Still, such hailstones seemed to me more like things that had been stationary, had been held in a field of thin ice. In the Illustrated London News, 34, 546, are drawings of hailstones so marginized as if they had been held in a sheet of ice. Some day, we shall have an expression which will be, to our advanced primitiveness, a great joy. That devils have visited this earth, foreign devils, human-like beings with pointed beards, good singers, one shoe ill-fitting, but with sulphurous exhalations at any rate. I have been impressed with the frequent occurrence of sulphurousness with things that come from the sky. A fall of jagged pieces of ice, Orkney, July 24, 1818. They had a strong sulphurous odor. And the coke, or the substance that looked like coke, that fell at Mortrey, France, April 24, 1887, With it fell a sulphurous substance. The enormous round thing that rose from the ocean near the Victoria. Whether we still accept that they were superconstructions that had come from a denser atmosphere and, in danger of disruption, had plunged into the ocean for relief, then rising and continuing on their way to Jupiter or Uranus. It was reported that they spread a, quote, stench of sulfur. At any rate, this datum of proximity is against the conventional explanation that these things did not rise from the ocean, but rose far away above the horizon, with illusion of nearness. And the things that were seen in the sky, July 1898. I have another note. In Nature, a correspondent writes that upon July 1st, 1898, at Sedberg, he had seen in the sky a red object, or in his own wording, something that looked like the part of a rainbow about 10 degrees long. But the sky was dark at the time the sun had set. A heavy rain was falling. Throughout this book, the datum that we are most impressed with, successive falls. Or that, if upon one small area things fall from the sky, and then later fall again upon the same small area, they are not products of a whirlwind, which, though sometimes axially stationary, discharges tangentially. So, the frogs that fell at Wigan. I have looked that matter up again. Later, more frogs fell. As to our data of gelatinous substance said to have fallen to this earth with meteorites, it is our expression that meteorites, tearing through the shaky protoplasmic seas of Genesistren, against which we warn aviators, or they may find themselves suffocating in a reservoir of life, or stuck like currants in a blancmange, that meteorites detach gelatinous or protoplasmic lumps that fall with them. Now the element of positiveness in our composition yearns for the appearance of completeness. Supergeographical lakes with fishes in them. Meteorites that plunged through these lakes on their way to this earth. The positiveness in our makeup must have expression in at least one record of a meteorite that has brought down a lot of fishes with it. Nature 3/512. That near the bank of a river in Peru, February 4th, 1871, a meteorite fell. Quote, on the spot it is reported several dead fishes were found of different species. End quote. The attempt to correlate is that the fishes, quote, are supposed to have been lifted out of the river and dashed against the stones, end quote. Whether this be imaginable or not depends upon each one's own hypnosis. Nature 4/169. That the fishes have fallen among the fragments of the meteorite. Popular Science Review 4/126. That one day, Mr. Lee Gold, an Australian scientist, was traveling in Queensland. He saw a tree that had been broken off close to the ground. Where the tree had been broken was a great bruise. Nearby was an object that, quote, resembled a 10-inch shot, end quote. A good many pages back there was an instance of overshadowing, I think. The little carved stone that fell at Tarbes is my own choice as the most impressive of our new correlates. It was coated with ice, remember. Suppose we should sift and discard half the data in this book. Suppose only that one datum should survive. To call attention to the stone of Tarbes would, in my opinion, be doing well enough for whatever the spirit of this book is trying to do. Nevertheless, it seems to me that a datum that preceded it was slightingly treated. The disk of quartz, said to have fallen from the sky after a meteoric explosion. Said to have fallen at the plantation Blijendal, Dutch Guiana. Sent to the Museum of Leyden by M. van Sijpenstein, adjutant to the governor of Dutch Guiana. And the fragments that fall from supergeographic ice fields, flat pieces of ice with icicles on them. I think that we did not emphasize that enough. If these structures were not icicles but crystalline protuberances, such crystalline formations indicate long suspensions quite as notably as would icicles. In the Popular Science News, it is said that in 1869, near Tiflis, fell large hailstones with long protuberances. Quote, "The most remarkable point in connection with the hailstones is the fact that, judging from our present knowledge, a very long time must have been occupied in their formation." End quote. According to the Geological Magazine, this fall occurred May 27, 1869. The writer in the Geological Magazine says that of all theories that he has ever heard of, not one could give him light as to this occurrence. Quote, "These growing crystalline forms must have been suspended a long time." End quote. Again and again, this phenomenon. 14 days later, at about the same place, more of these hailstones fell. Rivers of blood that vain albuminous sees, or an egg-like composition in the incubation of which this earth is a local center of development. That there are super arteries of blood in Genesitrine. That sunsets are consciousness of them. That they flush the skies with northern light sometimes, super embryonic reservoirs from which life forms emanate. Or that our whole solar system is a living thing, that showers of blood upon this earth are its internal hemorrhages. Or vast living things in the sky, as there are vast living things in the oceans. Or some one especial thing, an especial time, an especial place, a thing the size of the Brooklyn Bridge. It's alive in outer space. Something the size of Central Park kills it. It drips. We think of the ice fields above this earth, which do not themselves fall to this earth, but from which water does fall. Popular Science News 35, 104. That, according to Professor Luigi Palazzo, head of the Italian Meteorological Bureau, upon May 15, 1890, at Messignadi, Calabria, something the color of fresh blood fell from the sky. The substance was examined in the public health laboratories of Rome. It was found to be blood. Quote, "The most probable explanation of this terrifying phenomenon is that migratory birds, quails or swallows, were caught and torn in a violent wind." End quote. So, the substance was identified as bird's blood. What matters it what the microscopists of Rome said or had to say, and what matters it that we point out that there is no assertion that there was a violent wind at the time, and that such a substance would be almost infinitely dispersed in a violent wind, that no bird was said to have fallen from the sky, or said to have been seen in the sky, that not a feather of a bird is said to have been seen. This one datum, the fall of blood from the sky. But later, in the same place, blood again fell from the sky. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28. Notes and Queries. A correspondent who had been to Devonshire writes for information as to a story that he had heard there, of an occurrence of about 35 years before the date of writing. Of snow upon the ground, of all South Devonshire waking up one morning to find such tracks in the snow as had never before been heard of, quote, clawed footmarks, of, quote, an unclassifiable form, alternating at huge but regular intervals with what seemed to be the impression of the point of a stick. But the scattering of the prints, amazing expanse of territory covered, obstacles such as hedges, walls, houses, seemingly surmounted. Intense excitement, that the tracks had been followed by huntsmen and hounds until they had come to a forest, from which the hounds had retreated baying and terrified, so that no one had dared to enter the forest. Notes and Queries 7, 9, 18. Whole occurrence well remembered by a correspondent. A badger had left marks in the snow. This was determined, and the excitement had, quote, dropped to a dead calm in a single day. Notes and Queries 7, 9, 70. That for years a correspondent had had a tracing of the prints, which his mother had taken from those in the snow in her garden in Exmouth, that they were hoof-like marks, but had been made by a biped. Notes and Queries 7, 9, 253. Well remembered by another correspondent who writes of the excitement and consternation of, quote, some classes. He says that a kangaroo had escaped from a menagerie. Quote, the footprints being so peculiar and far apart gave rise to a scare that the devil was loose. End quote. We have had a story, and now we shall tell it over from contemporaneous sources. We have had the accounts first very largely for an impression of the correlating effect that time brings about. By addition, disregard and distortion. For instance, the, quote, dead calm in a single day. If I had found that the excitement did die out rather soon, I'd incline to accept that nothing extraordinary had occurred. I found that the excitement had continued for weeks. I recognized this as a well-adapted thing to say, to divert attention from a discorrelate. All phenomena are, quote, explained in the terms of the dominant of the era. This is why we give up trying really to explain and content ourselves with expressing. Devils that might print marks in snow are correlates to the third dominant back from this era. So it was an adjustment by 19th century correlates, or human tropisms, to say that the marks in the snow were clawed. Hoof-like marks are not only horsey, but devilish. It had to be said in the 19th century that those prints showed claw marks. We shall see that this was stated by Professor Owen, one of the greatest biologists of his day. Except that Darwin didn't think so. But I shall give reference to two representations of them that can be seen in the New York Public Library. In neither representation is there the faintest suggestion of a claw mark. There never has been a Professor Owen who has explained. He has correlated. Another adaptation in later accounts is that of leading this discorrelate to the old dominant into the familiar scenery of a fairy story, and discredit it by assimilation to the conventionally fictitious. So the idea of the baying, terrified hounds and forest-like enchanted forests, which no one dared to enter. Hunting parties were organized, but the baying, terrified hounds do not appear in contemporaneous accounts. The story of the kangaroo looks like adaptation to needs for an animal that could spring far, because marks were found in the snow on roofs of houses. But so astonishing is the extent of snow that was marked that after a while another kangaroo was added. But the marks were in single lines. My own acceptance is that not less than 1,000 one-legged kangaroos, each shod with a very small horseshoe, could have marked that snow of Devonshire. London Times, February 16, 1885, quote, considerable sensation has been caused in the towns of Topsham, Lympstone, Exmouth, Teignmouth, and Dawlish, in Devonshire, in consequence of the discovery of a vast number of foot tracks of the most strange and mysterious description. The story is of an incredible multiplicity of marks discovered in the morning of February 8, 1855, in the snow, by the inhabitants of many towns and regions between towns. This great area must, of course, be disregarded by Professor Owen and the other correlators. The tracks were in all kinds of unaccountable places, in gardens enclosed by high walls, and up on the tops of houses, as well as in the open fields. There was in Lympstone scarcely one unmarked garden. We've had heroic disregards, but I think that here disregard was titanic. And, because they occurred in single lines, the marks are said to have been, quote, more like those of a biped than of a quadruped, end quote. As if a biped would place one foot precisely ahead of another, unless it hopped. But then we have to think of 1,000 or of thousands. It is said that the marks were, quote, generally 8 inches in advance of each other. Quote, the impression of the foot closely resembles that of a donkey's shoe, and measures from 1.5 inches in some instances to 2.5 inches across. Or the impressions were cones in incomplete, or crescentic basins. The diameters equaled diameters of very young colt's hooves, too small to be compared with marks of donkey hoofs. Quote, on Sunday last, the Reverend Mr. Musgrave alluded to the subject in his sermon, and suggested the possibility of the footprints being those of a kangaroo. But this could scarcely have been the case, as they were found on both sides of the Este. At present it remains a mystery, and many superstitious people in the above-named towns are actually afraid to go outside their doors after night. End quote. The Este is a body of water 2 miles wide. London Times, March 6, 1855, quote, the interest in this matter has scarcely yet subsided, many inquiries still being made into the origin of the footprints, which caused so much consternation upon the morning of the 8th ultimo. In addition to the circumstances mentioned in the Times a little while ago, it may be stated that at Dawlish, a number of persons sallied out, armed with guns and other weapons, for the purpose, if possible, of discovering and destroying the animal which was supposed to have been so busy in multiplying its footprints. As might have been expected, the party returned as they went. Various speculations have been made as to the cause of the footprints. Some have asserted that they are those of a kangaroo, while others affirm that they are the impressions of claws of large birds driven ashore by stress of weather. On more than one occasion reports have been circulated that an animal from a menagerie had been caught, but the matter at present is as much involved in mystery as ever it was. End quote. In the Illustrated London News, the occurrence is given a great deal of space. In the issue of February 24, 1855, a sketch is given of the prints. I call them cones in incomplete basins. Except that they're a little longish, they look like prints of hoofs of horses, or rather of colts. But they're in a single line. It is said that the marks from which the sketch were made were 8 inches apart, and that this spacing was regular and invariable in every parish. Also, other towns besides those named in the Times are mentioned. The writer, who had spent a winter in Canada, was familiar with tracks in the snow, says that he had never seen, quote, a more clearly defined track. Also, he brings out the point that was so persistently disregarded by Professor Owen and the other correlators, that, quote, no known animal walks in a line of single footsteps, not even man. End quote. With these wider inclusions, this writer concludes with us that the marks were not footprints. It may have been that his following observation hits upon the crux of the whole occurrence, that whatever it may have been that had made the marks, it had removed, rather than pressed, the snow. According to his observations, the snow looked, quote, as if branded with a hot iron. Illustrated London News, March 3, 1855, 2:14. Professor Owen, to whom a friend had sent drawings of the prints, writes that there were claw marks. He says that the, quote, track was made by a badger. 6 other witnesses sent letters to this number of the News. One mentioned, but not published, is a notion of a stray swan. Always this homogeneous seeing, a badger, a swan, a track. I should have listed the other towns as well as those mentioned in the Times. A letter from Mr. Musgrave is published. He too sends a sketch of the prints. It too shows a single line. There are 4 prints, of which the third is a little out of line. There is no sign of a claw mark. The prints look like prints of a longish hoof of a very young colt, but they are not so definitely outlined as in the sketch of February 24th, as if drawn after disturbance by wind, or after thawing had set in. Measurements at places 1.5 miles apart gave the same inner spacing, quote, exactly 8.5 inches apart. We now have a little study in the psychology and genius of an attempted correlation. Mr. Musgrave says, quote, I found a very apt opportunity to mention the name kangaroo in allusion to the report then current, end quote. He says that he had no faith in the kangaroo story himself, but was glad, quote, that a kangaroo was in the wind, end quote, because it opposed, quote, a dangerous, degrading, and false impression that it was the devil, end quote. Quote, mine was a word in season and did good, end quote. Whether it's Jesuitical or not, and no matter what is or isn't, that is our own acceptance that, though we've often been carried away from this attitude controversially, that is our acceptance as to every correlate of the past that has been considered in this book, relatively to the dominant of its era. Another correspondent writes that, though the prints in all cases resembled hoof marks, there were indistinct traces of claws, that an otter made the marks. After that, many other witnesses wrote to the news. The correspondence was so great that, in the issue of March 10th, only a selection could be given. There's a jumping rat solution and a hopping toad inspiration, and then someone came out strong with the idea of a hare that had galloped with a pair of feet held close together, so as to make impressions in a single line. London Times, March 14th, 1840, quote, among the high mountains of that elevated district, where Glenorchy, Glenlyon, and Glenochet are contiguous, there have been met with several times, during this and also the former winter, upon the snow, the tracks of an animal seemingly unknown at present in Scotland. The print, in every respect, is an exact resemblance to that of a foal of considerable size, with this small difference, perhaps, that the sole seems a little longer or not so round. But as no one has had the good fortune as yet to have obtained a glimpse of this creature, nothing more can be said of its shape or dimensions. Only it has been remarked from the depth to which the feet sank in the snow that it must be a beast of considerable size. It has been observed also that its walk is not like that of the generality of quadrupeds, but that it is more like the bounding or leaping of a horse when scared or pursued. It is not in one locality that its tracks have been met with, but through a range of at least 12 miles. End quote. In the Illustrated London News, March 17, 1855, a correspondent from Heidelberg writes, quote, upon the authority of a Polish doctor of medicine, end quote, that the Piaszawa Góra, Sand Hill, a small elevation on the border of Galicia, but in Russian Poland, such marks are to be seen in the snow every year, and sometimes in the sand of this hill, and, quote, are attributed by the inhabitants to supernatural influences. End of chapter 28. End of The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort.